Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It was late, too late for someone who had been alone in the same studio for hours. The walls, once white and calm, now seemed to echo with a quiet tension. The brush strokes on the canvas had been flowing freely at first, creative, uninhibited, but now they felt wrong. Something in the room had changed, something unexplainable. Liam rubbed his eyes and stared at the painting before him. The subject was simple enough, a landscape, a field with a single tree in the distance, and a cloudy sky overhead. But there, in the far corner of the canvas, something was different. A shadow, he swore, had appeared in the background, one he hadn't painted. It was no bigger than a smear at first, just a dark spot against the horizon. But as he watched, it seemed to grow, stretching unnaturally across the field. He leaned in closer. No, it wasn't possible. He hadn't edited it. His hand hadn't even touched that part of the canvas. He stepped back and shook his head. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you, Liam," he muttered under his breath. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. The room was quiet, but the silence was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Then, just as Liam thought he could convince himself it was nothing, the floor creaked behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. His heart raced, and his pulse quickened. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to flicker, like they were shifting, like they were waiting. The sound came again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, dragging across the hardwood. The problem was, he was alone. He knew he was alone. His eyes darted back to the canvas. The shadow had grown. It was no longer a mere smear. The shape was clearer now, more defined, as if something was emerging from within the paint. A figure. No, he whispered to himself. No, this isn't happening. He turned toward the window, hoping the night air would clear his head. But when his eyes caught the street lamp outside, a chill ran down his spine. The lamp flickered twice, then went out. It wasn't the storm that had caused it. There was no storm. Just a still, oppressive night. Liam swallowed hard and tried to shake the feeling off. "It's just stress," he told himself. "You've been working too long. You just need some rest." But as he stepped toward the door, the footsteps behind him grew louder. Someone was there. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice quivering more than he intended. No answer. And then, in a flicker of light, something moved on the canvas. A figure, a shape, was stepping out, not from the edges, but from the center, as if the paint itself had come to life. The longer Liam stared, the clearer it became. It was the same tree from the painting, but now it wasn't a tree at all. It was something else. Something wrong. A shrill cry lodged itself in his throat, but no sound came out. The figure was twisting, its limbs contorting in unnatural angles, stretching, growing. It wasn't just in the painting now, it was filling the room, slowly, silently, creeping toward him. The lights flickered again, and for a second, the shadows seemed to converge around him, moving as though they had a life of their own. His body froze. His chest tightened. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he backed away. But the thing on the canvas was no longer confined. It was moving, inching closer to him. He had to get out. Liam's breath came in shallow gasps. He fumbled with the doorknob, his vision blurring as he tried to force the door open. The air in the room thickened, the smell of something metallic, like blood, filling his nose. The figure on the canvas grew more distinct now. Its face, if it could be called that, was almost human. Almost. But its features were distorted, elongated, its mouth stretching far beyond what should have been possible. And its eyes, they weren't eyes at all. Just empty, black voids. Liam didn't know how, but somehow he managed to wrench open the door. His feet carried him into the hallway, but the sound of the footsteps, the dragging, scraping sound, followed. He could feel them now, not just in the room, but in the walls, in the floor beneath him. It was getting closer. Is this real? Am I dreaming? He thought, his mind racing, slipping into a panic. A distant part of him told him to wake up, that this was all just a trick of the mind, a result of too many late nights, too much isolation. But another part of him knew, deep down, that this wasn't just his imagination. He heard a voice, soft but clear, whisper from the darkness. Liam. His blood ran cold. He turned back toward the studio door, but the hallway had changed. The walls were no longer white, no longer the comforting plaster they had been. They were dark, like the painted figure, like the eyes, the voids that were staring at him from the canvas. He couldn't remember when the room had changed. He couldn't remember when it had become a prison. The thing in the painting, whatever it was no longer confined to the canvas. And it was coming for him. Liam's pulse pounded in his ears as he stumbled down the hallway, his shoes slapping the wooden floor with each hurried step. His breath came in frantic bursts, his chest tight with a cold panic that didn't feel like it was his own. Something was wrong. This wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something primal that clawed at him from the inside. The hall stretched out before him, but it felt endless now. The walls, once familiar, now seemed to close in around him, their edges blurry, as though the room itself was warping. He could no longer tell what was real. The flickering light above him cast long, twisted shadows across the floor, stretching toward him like arms that wanted to drag him back. No, Liam gasped, shaking his head, trying to push past the tightening grip of the panic rising within him. I need to get out. Just get out. But the door, the front door, was still too far. The sound of scraping, dragging feet had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. He reached the door, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around the handle. For a split second, it felt like he was being held there, as if the very air around him was pressing against him, unwilling to let him go. His heartbeat quickened as he twisted the handle, only to find the door wouldn't budge. Liam jerked harder, trying again. The door stayed locked. Come on, he shouted, pulling with all his strength. But the door remained still. The panic swelled in his chest, and suddenly he was pulling at the knob frantically, his fingers slipping against the smooth surface, his mind spiraling. What's happening? Why can't I? A sound, a whisper, came from the darkness behind him. Liam. He froze. The voice wasn't like the last one. This one was softer, almost tender, as though it was coaxing him, trying to pull him back. The familiar, almost comforting sound of his own name. The kind of voice that only someone close to you would use. But it wasn't his mother, or his friend, or anyone else he could recognize. It wasn't a person at all. His hand froze on the door handle, his heart beating louder than before. He turned his head, just enough to see the shadows behind him start to shift. No. The edges of the hallway were now bent, the walls growing in odd directions, like they were being stretched by invisible hands. The air was thicker now, heavier, like it was laced with something he couldn't name. The shadows at the corners seemed to move in rhythm, like a heartbeat, pulsing in time with his own. He could feel it. The pressure, the weight of something watching him. But when he turned his head, there was nothing. The shadows were silent. He turned back to the door. The handle was still cold beneath his palm, but the room was no longer the same. The space behind him had grown, had twisted, and now it wasn't just the shadows moving. Something was there. A figure, just out of the corner of his vision, hanging in the periphery. It wasn't solid, not quite, but it was growing, drawing closer. It felt alive. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They called his name over and over, but each time it sounded more distorted. Liam. Liam spun around, his eyes scanning the shadows, trying to pinpoint the source, but nothing was there. Just the same warped space, the same flickering lights. But the presence, the pressure, was unmistakable. He shoved his shoulder against the door, desperate. Why won't you open? In the back of his mind, a thought nagged at him, this isn't real. This isn't happening. But the thing that had crawled out of his painting, out of the very canvas, was real. He could feel it now, like something invisible was wrapping its fingers around his throat, pulling tighter with each passing second. The walls around him were no longer the walls of his home. No, this place, it was becoming something else. Something darker. Something wrong. With a sudden, sharp movement, the door clicked open. For a moment, Liam hesitated, his body shaking. Run, a voice whispered again, but this time it was unmistakable. It was his voice. Without thinking, without second-guessing, he bolted through the door, into the night. The air outside was cold and sharp, but the chill felt nothing compared to the suffocating warmth that had filled the room behind him. The sky was an inky black, the stars scattered across the heavens like a million eyes watching him. He stumbled onto the porch, his legs barely holding him up as his body shook uncontrollably. The house loomed behind him, silent now. But as he turned, his gaze locked onto the windows, where dark shapes seemed to move just out of view behind the glass. Liam didn't dare stay. He ran. As he sprinted down the driveway, the night air whipping against his face, he thought he heard something following him. Not footsteps. No. It was something else. A faint sound, something scraping across the pavement, like nails against stone. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Somewhere in the distance, the soft whisper of his name carried on the wind. Liam. Liam's breath came in ragged bursts as his feet pounded the pavement. The air was colder now, the weight of the night pressing down on him with each step. The houses around him were distant, unfamiliar in the darkness. He couldn't remember how far he'd run, he wasn't sure he cared. He only knew he couldn't stop. Not yet. His mind was a chaotic whirl of images, the room, the figure in the painting, the whispers. But the worst part, the thing that kept him running, kept his pulse thrumming in his ears, was the feeling that he wasn't truly alone. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. No, it was something much worse. Something that followed him, that reached into him with cold, invisible fingers. Behind him, the darkness seemed to stretch, like it was following, enveloping the streets, swallowing the light from the nearby lampposts. The city felt wrong. The quiet was suffocating. The sound of his own footsteps was the only thing that filled the air, the rhythm of his panicked movement marking time. But then, another sound. A scraping, a dragging, soft but unmistakable, just barely within earshot. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rustling of leaves. It was something else. Something that had no place in the night. Liam stumbled and almost fell, but he righted himself, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. He glanced back. The street behind him was empty. The shadows were just shadows. The quiet was just quiet. Focus. Focus, he told himself. Keep going. Just keep moving. His eyes burned, his chest ached, and the city around him seemed to close in tighter with every step. He hadn't noticed before, but now he could see it clearly. The buildings were all wrong. The windows were darker than they should have been, their edges blurred, as though the entire town had been dipped in ink. And still, the dragging sound followed him. Closer now. The street ahead of him twisted, the road no longer straight but curving at an unnatural angle, bending away from where he knew it should lead. He tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as a trick of his exhausted mind, but the sense of wrongness grew with every step. He didn't know if he was heading towards safety or towards something much worse. His eyes darted to the nearest alley, an instinct, a strange pull urging him in that direction. The alley seemed darker than it should have been, the air colder. A shiver crawled up his spine. But something in him told him to go there. Maybe it was the hope of finding shelter. Maybe it was the desperation to escape. But he turned into the alley. The sounds of his footsteps seemed muffled in the narrow space between the buildings, as if the world itself was trying to swallow him whole. He barely noticed the way the walls seemed to stretch above him, higher than they should have been, or how the alley grew narrower with every step. And then, there it was. At the far end of the alley, a faint glow, dim, pulsing, came from an open door. A door that hadn't been there a moment ago. It stood ajar, inviting. But it wasn't the light that drew him. It was the feeling. The one he couldn't shake. Liam didn't think. He couldn't. His legs carried him forward, drawn toward the door as though some invisible force was pulling him in. The shadows around him seemed to shift, move in sync with his footsteps. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he gripped the cold handle. The moment his fingers touched it, a chill ran through him. It wasn't the cold of the night. It was something deeper. Something that dug into his bones. He pushed the door open. Inside was a room unlike any he'd seen before. The walls were dark, but not like the walls of the alley. These were alive with swirling patterns, black and red, twisting and shifting in a way that made his stomach churn. The air inside was thick, heavy, with the scent of something metallic, something familiar and wrong at the same time. The floor was covered in what looked like splattered paint. No, it was darker than paint. Darker than anything. And in the center of the room, a canvas stood on an easel, its frame old and weathered. He felt his heart pound as he stepped closer. The painting on the canvas wasn't just a painting. It was alive. Liam's throat tightened. The figure, the one from his earlier painting, was there. But it was different now. The creature was no longer confined to the canvas. Its eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to follow him as he moved, its twisted, elongated limbs reaching out from the painting, stretching into the room like they were trying to break free. His feet were glued to the floor. He couldn't look away. The figure's face, distorted, malformed, twisted into something that was almost a smile. Liam, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just his name. It was a command. It wanted something. His chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but the room was closing in around him. The shadows seemed to rise from the floor, coiling like tendrils, wrapping around his legs, pulling him closer to the canvas. He had to get away. But the door he had come through, was gone. The alley was gone. The only thing left was the painting and the thing inside it. The thing that was no longer just a figment of his imagination. And then, just as his mind screamed at him to break free, the figure stepped out of the painting. Not from the edges. No, it moved as if it was never confined to the canvas at all. It was real. It was here. And it was coming for him. Liam's heart stopped. The thing that had once been a mere image on the canvas was now standing before him, its form distorted, impossibly wrong. The room seemed to tremble under its presence. The air thickened, pressing down on him, suffocating him. It was more than a creature, it was a nightmare made flesh. Its limbs were twisted, unnaturally long, ending in fingers that reached toward him, each one bending in ways that should have been impossible. The face was almost human, but there was something fundamentally wrong with it. Its eyes, hollow and black, were empty voids, and its mouth, stretched wide in an unsettling grin, seemed to be made of too many teeth, too many jagged, broken teeth. Liam could feel his body tremble, his mind racing for any sense of logic to explain this, but none came. There was no explanation. There was only the thing, and the suffocating certainty that it wasn't just part of his imagination. It was real. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky, unnatural, like it was still learning how to move, how to walk. Its eyes never left him. Liam, it whispered again, but this time it wasn't his name. It was a command. Come closer. Liam's chest tightened. He wanted to run, to turn and flee, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body was frozen, locked in place by some invisible force, some power that seeped out of the very walls, the very air. The thing's grin grew wider, stretching impossibly wide, and it leaned closer. Its breath was cold, like the void itself, and it reeked of decay, of rot. Why are you doing this? Liam's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the words hung in the air like the echo of a forgotten nightmare. He tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, constricted. The room was spinning, the walls pulsing with each beat of his panicked heart. The creature didn't answer. It didn't need to. Instead, it reached out. One of its grotesque hands hovered in the air, then suddenly shot forward, fingers elongated, wrapping around Liam's wrist in an iron grip. He gasped, a surge of cold running up his arm, as though the very essence of the thing was seeping into him. It pulled him closer. Liam struggled, but his body felt like it was made of lead. Every attempt to break free was met with resistance, like an invisible weight pressing down on him, holding him in place. His breath quickened, the panic surging, but the creature didn't seem to care. It dragged him forward, effortlessly, as though he weighed nothing. He could feel its eyes on him, a presence so intense that it felt like it was seeping into his skin, into his mind. No, Liam croaked. His heart raced, a dull ache filling his chest. His entire being screamed for him to break free, but every fiber of his body seemed to betray him. The creature's grip tightened, its fingers digging into his skin, drawing a sharp pain that only seemed to make the terror worse. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift again. The walls were no longer just walls. They were alive, pulsating, their surfaces undulating like the skin of some massive creature. The floor beneath him trembled, and the shadows stretched out, crawling along the walls, moving with a life of their own. Liam's mind spun. He could no longer tell what was real, what was an illusion. The room was changing, bending and shifting like it was part of some nightmare. The creature's smile grew wider, its twisted mouth opening in a soundless laugh. It leaned in closer, its breath cold against Liam's ear. "You can't run," it whispered. "You can't hide. You're mine." With a violent twist, the creature yanked Liam's arm, forcing him down to the ground. He stumbled, his knees buckling, but he couldn't break free. It was as if the world itself was against him, pressing in, forcing him into submission. Desperation clawed at him. He had to get out. He couldn't die here, not like this. His hands scrambled on the floor, searching for anything to use to fight back. His fingers brushed against something cold, something solid. A brush. A paintbrush. Without thinking, without fully realizing what he was doing, Liam gripped the brush tightly, using all his strength to slam the handle into the creature's side. It was like striking a wall of stone. The creature didn't flinch. Didn't even seem to notice. But Liam didn't stop. He swung again, harder this time, and the brush hit the creature's chest with a sickening crack. The thing's grip loosened for a moment, just enough for him to pull away. He ran. He didn't know where, but he ran. The world around him seemed to shift again, like the very reality was warping, but his feet carried him forward, through the space that no longer resembled anything familiar. His body was moving on its own, adrenaline surging through him, pushing him to run faster, to escape whatever nightmare he had unwittingly stepped into. The creature didn't chase him. Not yet. But he could feel it behind him, its presence, its weight pressing down on his every step. It was still there, still watching. And as he ran, the whisper followed, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't escape." He didn't look back. Liam ran. And ran. Until the night swallowed him whole. Liam's breath came in ragged gasps, the air sharp and cold against his lungs. His legs ached from the strain of running, but he couldn't stop. Every step felt like it was pushing him deeper into a nightmare that he couldn't escape. The streets, if they could even be called that now, twisted unnaturally, bending and shifting as though they were made from the very darkness itself. The city was no longer a place he recognized. It was as though the world had folded in on itself, reshaping into something unfamiliar, hostile. He didn't know how long he'd been running. Time had lost all meaning. The lights had long since gone out, and the only illumination came from the faint glow of distant, sickly street lamps that flickered as though they were gasping for life. Behind him, the sound of the creature's dragging footsteps was always there. Soft at first, then louder, closer, relentless. It was like a pulse, a rhythm that beat in time with his own panicked heart. He tried not to listen, tried to block out the sound, but it was impossible. It was like the thing was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every step he took. Liam stumbled, his vision blurring. He had no idea where he was going, just away from it. Away from the thing that had once been a painting, a nightmare, and now was real. A part of him wondered if he was losing his mind. Was it all in his head? But then he would hear the dragging again, the whisper of its name, and he knew it was real. There was no escape. His foot caught on something, a broken piece of pavement, and he fell, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he didn't have time to recover. He pushed himself up, but when he did, something caught his eye. Something that froze him in place. In the distance, just ahead of him, he saw the door again. The same door. The one he had found in the alley. It was there, as though it had always been there, waiting for him. The same faint, pulsing glow seeped through the cracks around it, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. His breath hitched. No. He couldn't go back there. He couldn't go back to that room, to that painting, to that thing. But as much as he tried to fight it, as much as his instinct screamed at him to turn away, his feet moved toward the door. He couldn't explain why. It was as though something in him, something deep within his soul, was pulling him there, unwillingly, inexorably. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he placed it on the handle. The cold seeped through his fingers. It was like the door itself was made of ice. He had to go inside. He had no choice. The door creaked open. The room beyond was different this time. It was darker, colder. The walls, if they could even be called that, were no longer solid. They seemed to be made of shifting shadows, swirling in and out of existence like a living nightmare. The floor beneath him was slick with something wet, something sticky, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. And there, in the center of the room, was the canvas again. The painting. It was still the same, and yet it wasn't. The figure was there, its twisted form frozen in time, but now its eyes were open. Wide. Unblinking. Staring right at him. Liam's blood ran cold. The room felt smaller, as though it was closing in on him. The shadows seemed to writhe, the walls bending inward, the air growing heavier with every breath he took. And then, with a terrible, sickening realization, he knew. The painting wasn't just a painting anymore. It was watching him. It had been watching him all along. Liam. The whisper came again, soft, almost like a caress, but this time it wasn't just in his ear. It was inside his head, burrowing into his thoughts, into his very being. The creature in the painting, it wasn't just following him. It had always been with him. It was inside him. It was in his thoughts, in his dreams. He had been drawing it, painting it, inviting it into his life without even knowing it. He had thought it was just his imagination. But now, it was real. A laugh echoed through the room. Not the creature's laugh, but something deeper, something far more unsettling. The shadows around him twisted, stretched, and formed shapes. Dark shapes. Figures. All around him. They weren't human. They were distorted, like twisted versions of things that once were. Faces without eyes. Bodies without shape. And yet, they all moved toward him. Liam took a step back, his heart thundering in his chest, but he couldn't stop himself. His body was moving on its own, as if it were being controlled, as if it were becoming a part of this nightmare. No, no, he whispered, backing away. I can't. The door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, desperate to escape, but the room had shifted again. The walls were now covered in the same swirling patterns from the painting. The figures from the shadows were closing in, their twisted, gaping mouths whispering his name. Liam, they chorused. And in the center of it all, standing like a nightmare made flesh, was the creature. Its eyes locked onto his, and it grinned. Liam couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only stare as the thing stepped toward him, its long fingers twitching, stretching toward his face. This time, there would be no escape. I never thought I would find myself in a place like this. The old hotel had a peculiar charm at first, something quiet and mysterious. The kind of place where the creaky floorboards seem to whisper secrets if you listen closely enough. But something was off. It wasn't the grand chandeliers or the faded wallpaper, nor the faint musty smell that clung to the hallways like a distant memory. It was something else. Something that made the air feel thicker, colder. I had checked in the night before. The receptionist, a woman with a gaze that felt strangely distant, handed me an old-fashioned brass key. It looked out of place, almost too old for the building. But I shrugged it off, attributing it to the hotel's vintage decor. I was traveling alone, not expecting much. Just a quiet stay in a forgotten part of the city. But there was a corridor on the third floor that I couldn't shake off. At first, it seemed like any other hallway, dimly lit, with doors on either side, each leading to rooms I assumed were empty. But as I passed it several times during my stay, something about it started to feel wrong. I'm not a superstitious man, but I found myself hesitating at its entrance. I couldn't explain why. It was as though the corridor was calling to me, a gentle pull that seemed to whisper from the shadows. Every time I walked past it, I noticed something odd, something I couldn't quite place. The hallway wasn't just empty. It felt alive. Like it was waiting. Watching. And then, one night, curiosity overcame me. I stepped into the corridor for the first time. The light from the overhead fixture flickered once, twice, then settled into a dull hum. The air grew colder the deeper I walked. I felt a chill, but not the kind that would come from an open window. It was more like the very walls were exhaling their breath onto me. It wasn't much different from any other hallway in the hotel, except for one thing. There was no end. The corridor stretched on, farther than it should have, curving out of sight. The doors on either side were closed, just like the rest of the building, but something was off about them. I don't know how to explain it, but there was a sense of movement behind them, a slight, barely perceptible shifting in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned to walk back, but the atmosphere seemed to change. The air felt thicker, heavier. It was harder to breathe, like something was pressing down on my chest. I could hear the faintest noise, something soft, like a whisper. I froze. I told myself it was just the wind or the building settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. I took another step, my foot dragging against the worn carpet. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows ahead. But when I blinked, it was gone. I couldn't bring myself to turn around and leave. Something pulled me forward, a strange urge that I couldn't resist. So, I kept walking, further down the dark corridor, past the silent doors that seemed to stare at me like forgotten faces. Then, a door at the end of the hallway caught my attention. It was different from the others. Its surface was worn and scarred, as if someone, or something, had been trying to get inside. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering sound grew louder, and I couldn't tell if it was real or just in my head. But I had to know what was behind that door. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. It was cold to the touch, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones. I hesitated. Something felt wrong. But before I could pull my hand away, the door creaked open by itself, the sound echoing down the hallway. I stepped inside. At first, everything seemed normal. It was a small, dimly lit room, nothing special. The walls were lined with old paintings, most of them faded and cracked with age. But there was something off about the room. The air inside felt heavy, like it had been sealed away for years. And the longer I stood there, the more I could feel it, something was wrong. I turned around to leave, but the door was no longer there. It had vanished, replaced by nothing but a thick, suffocating darkness. I couldn't see the walls anymore, couldn't tell which direction I had come from. Panic began to rise in my chest. I reached out, my hand brushing against the smooth, cold surface where the door had once been. But it was gone. I took a step back. The room was closing in on me. The air grew colder still. The whispering returned, this time louder, more urgent. It wasn't just in my mind. I could hear voices now, soft, unintelligible words, like a dozen people murmuring just out of reach. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel them, pressing against my mind, filling my thoughts. And then the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a small shifting in the dark. But as I turned to face it, the shadows grew, stretching toward me. I could see shapes now, faint outlines of figures, but they didn't look right. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they didn't belong in this place. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the room itself was holding me in place, trapping me here with the shadows, with the voices. Then, I saw it. One of the figures moved closer, its form becoming clearer. It was tall, thin, its face a blur of indistinct features, and as it stepped forward, its eyes locked onto mine. It was watching me. And suddenly, the shadows weren't just moving anymore. They were closing in. I couldn't breathe. The air had become thick, almost suffocating, and I felt a coldness creeping beneath my skin. The shadows, once mere flickers, had grown into a presence that enveloped me, suffocating the small room I had found myself in. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat deafening against the silence that had taken over the space. I tried to move, but my body felt frozen, as if the floor beneath me had solidified, chaining me in place. The figure, the one with the indistinct face, stepped closer. Its presence sent a chill down my spine that I couldn't shake, even as my thoughts scrambled for a way out. The whispering voices had grown louder, though their words remained unintelligible. It was as though they were all around me now, thousands of them, pressing into my mind like a flood, demanding attention, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't understand. I could feel their gaze now. Every inch of my skin prickled under the weight of invisible eyes, watching, studying, waiting for something. Something that I couldn't grasp. The shadow reached out, its elongated arms stretching towards me. I jerked backwards, my feet finally finding the courage to move. My legs felt weak, as if the very air had stolen my strength, but I pushed forward. I needed to get out. I had to. The walls seemed to close in around me as I stumbled, panic overtaking any rational thought. The door, the one that had vanished only moments ago, reappeared in front of me. But it wasn't a welcoming sight. It was no longer a wooden frame with a simple handle. It was warped, its edges frayed, as if it had been there for far longer than the hotel had even existed. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The same coldness that had gripped me earlier shot through my body again, but I didn't hesitate this time. I pulled the door open. The hallway outside was different. It wasn't the same one I had entered through. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly, the light dimmer than before. It felt wrong, too vast, too endless. I could barely make out the faint outlines of doors, some cracked open, others sealed shut. But none of them looked familiar. None of them looked like the ones I had passed earlier. I stepped into the hallway, but before I could make sense of my surroundings, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound sharp and final. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, but the door was gone again. Just like before. There was only darkness where it had once been. I was trapped. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing. I had to stay calm. I had to think. But the hallway, the one I had walked down countless times during my stay in this hotel, was no longer just a hallway. It was alive, pulsing with an eerie energy that radiated from the walls themselves. And as I stared down the corridor, I realized something worse than the shadows that had once stalked me. There was something else now. Something new. I took a hesitant step forward. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally, louder than I had expected. And then I heard it. A soft, slow creak. The floorboards. No. It wasn't just the sound of old wood settling. This was something different. Something deliberate. And the creaking was getting closer. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the darkened hallway. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the far distance, cloaked in shadow. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it. The sense that it wasn't human. The way it seemed to move with unnatural fluidity, its form distorting as it shifted in and out of the darkness. It was coming toward me. The whispering, which had never stopped, grew louder, more urgent. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the intent. The need to get away, to escape this place, pressed heavily on my chest. But no matter how much I willed my legs to move, they wouldn't obey. It was as though something had taken control of me, as if the hallway itself were pulling me back, pushing me toward the approaching figure. And then I saw the eyes. Two glistening, dark pools in the distance, fixed on me. There was something so unnatural about them, something hollow and empty. They didn't belong to any living thing. They felt like they were part of the very fabric of the corridor itself, something ancient, something that had been waiting. I took another step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure didn't stop. It didn't slow. It moved with an inevitable, deliberate pace, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. I had to move. I had to get out of here. But no matter how much I tried to will my body to flee, I felt rooted in place, my legs unwilling to take me anywhere but toward the figure. Then it spoke. A voice, no, not a voice, something more like a low hum that vibrated through my bones. The sound was everywhere, surrounding me. It didn't come from the figure, but from all around me, from the very walls, the ceiling, the air itself. It was a voice without words. It was hunger. The figure stopped. And I knew, in that moment, that it wasn't just watching me. It was waiting for me. For the first time since entering the corridor, I felt the unmistakable sensation of pure terror. My heart stopped, and I could feel the weight of my own breath, shallow and frantic. I had to get out. I had to escape. But there was no way out. The air seemed to thicken with every passing second, the weight of it pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. The figure hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence like an invisible hand, reaching out, drawing me closer. My mind was in turmoil, fighting to remain rational, but the fear, it was overwhelming. My breath quickened, every small sound amplified in the silence of the hallway. The creaking of the floorboards became more pronounced, now unmistakably the sound of something or someone slowly advancing. But I couldn't bring myself to turn and face it. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the distant darkness where the figure had paused. The eyes, they were still there, gleaming, hungry. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air stilled, the whispers ceased, and the only sound was the pounding of my own heart. I couldn't tell if the corridor had grown quieter or if my mind had simply shut out everything except the fear. It was all-consuming. And then, a step. It was soft, barely audible, but it was enough. Enough to snap me out of my stupor, enough to drive the panic into my chest. Without thinking, I turned and bolted. My legs finally responded, pushing me forward into the endless stretch of the hallway. I didn't know where I was running, didn't know what was ahead or if there was even an exit, but I had to go. I had to get away from the eyes, from the figure that was slowly, inevitably, closing in on me. The hallway twisted. I hadn't imagined it, this place was shifting. The walls were no longer straight. They seemed to bend, to curve, to warp in ways that made no sense. Doors I hadn't seen before appeared on my left and right, some ajar, others shut tight. Some even seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, breathing in rhythm with the tension that thrummed through the air. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. The slow, methodical footsteps behind me. I couldn't outrun it, not in this place. The figure was relentless. The corridor stretched on, seemingly without end. My vision blurred with the panic rising in my chest, my breaths coming too fast, too shallow. I couldn't keep this up. I couldn't keep running. Suddenly, I stumbled, my foot catching on something invisible. I fell hard against the floor, my hand scraping against the cold wood as I tried to push myself back up. But something caught me. A presence. A shadow, creeping from the very walls themselves. The whispers began again, this time louder, more distinct. They weren't just sounds. They were voices that seemed to be speaking directly to me, their words sharp and insistent. You cannot escape. You cannot leave. The words echoed, reverberating in my skull. My head throbbed. I clutched my ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder. And then, a new voice joined in. This one wasn't just a whisper. It was a low, guttural growl. Stay with us. I didn't understand. I didn't want to. But the more I fought, the more it felt like I was sinking deeper into the abyss. The walls around me were no longer just walls. They were breathing, moving, pulling me in. The corridor had become alive, and I was part of it now. Part of something dark, something ancient. I managed to pull myself to my feet, swaying with dizziness. My body ached, my legs trembling under the weight of fear. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself be swallowed by whatever was chasing me. I forced my legs to move, pushing forward through the nightmare that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. There was a door ahead. It was different from the others. It was solid, wooden, and it stood alone in the middle of the corridor, bathed in a faint, unnatural light. It was a door that didn't belong in this place, a door that might lead to an escape. I ran toward it, desperation fueling my every step. But as I neared the door, I felt something shift in the air. A presence behind me, closer this time. The footsteps, the whispers, they were right there, so close that I could almost feel the cold breath of the figure on my neck. I grabbed the door handle, throwing it open without hesitation. My heart skipped a beat when I saw what was beyond it. It wasn't a room. It was more corridor. Endless. It stretched out into oblivion, just like the one I had come from. I stepped back, the door slamming shut behind me, and I realized with horror that the hallway had changed again. This time, I wasn't just running away. I was being pulled into it, like a rat in a maze, trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape. I turned, but there was no way back. The walls around me were alive, watching, waiting. And then, I heard it. A voice. Not from behind me, but from ahead. A voice that sounded almost familiar. You belong here. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if they were coming from the figure. It could have been from the very corridor itself. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel the truth of those words sinking in. This place, this hotel, it wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And I was its prisoner. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. The voice that had come from nowhere, echoed in my mind, repeating its words over and over again, each time growing louder, more insistent. You belong here. My legs trembled beneath me, but I didn't dare take a step. The corridor had changed. It felt tighter now, the air heavier, almost oppressive, as if it were closing in around me. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their surfaces shifting subtly, flickering like shadows. And then, from somewhere deep within the hallway, I heard it again. The creak of floorboards. It was closer this time. Too close. I spun around, my eyes frantically scanning the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just shadows, stretching longer than they should have, twisting and curling in ways that didn't make sense. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air, white and thick. It felt like I was suffocating. My mind screamed for answers, but there were none. I had to get out. I had to leave. But how? The hallway didn't end. It just went on forever, a never-ending loop of darkness and whispers. And then I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a figure stepped into view. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. It had shape, distinct, solid. It was tall, too tall, its form distorted, as though it was trying to fit into the space, but couldn't. It moved toward me with that same unnerving fluidity. It stepped silent, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my body was rooted to the spot. The figure wasn't human. It was something else, something wrong. It moved without sound, without haste, but the feeling it gave me was suffocating. The weight of its presence pressed in on me from all sides. Leave. The whisper returned, this time different, more insistent. Leave before it's too late. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to demand what was happening, but no words came. There was only the silence that seemed to stretch endlessly around me, broken only by the soft sound of my breath. The figure took another step forward, and with it, the corridor seemed to grow darker. The walls seemed to ripple, their edges shifting, twisting like they were alive. And as the figure moved closer, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Its face. It was not a face at all, but a void, a black hole, sucking in the light around it. There were no eyes, no features, just a gaping emptiness. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something unseen. My heart raced, panic seizing me once again. The figure didn't stop. It didn't slow. It was coming for me, and I couldn't outrun it. I had to do something. I had to fight back. I looked around, desperate for anything that could help me, but the hallway remained barren. Nothing. There was nothing but shadows and the figure, which was now only a few feet away. I could feel it in my bones now. The pull of it, like gravity itself, was working against me. I was being drawn toward it, like a moth to a flame. Suddenly, the figure stopped. Its presence filled the space between us, and the hallway seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. The figure remained still, and I was frozen in place, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then, the voice returned. "You cannot escape. This is where you belong. We all belong here." The words felt like a heavy weight, sinking into my chest. The hallway seemed to stretch even further, the walls pressing in, the shadows growing thicker, darker. I could feel my mind starting to unravel. The whispers. The eyes. The never-ending hallway. It was all part of it. This place, this hotel, it was not just haunted. It was something else, something far worse. It was alive. I reached for the walls, my fingers brushing against the cold, slick surface. There was something damp there, like mold or sweat, but it wasn't just the walls. It was the very air, thick with a presence that I couldn't escape. The figure was still there, its shape barely discernible in the darkness. I couldn't see its face anymore, but I could feel it. The void of it, the absence of everything that was human or real. "Stay with us," it whispered, its voice no longer distant but right beside my ear, as if it were inside my head. "We are all part of this place." A surge of panic rushed through me, but before I could react, I felt something cold against my neck. I froze. A hand. It was ice cold, its touch like death itself. And then I heard the faintest whisper, just a breath. "It's too late." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows. And then everything went dark. For a moment, there was nothing. The hallway, the figure, the voices, all of it disappeared. It was just darkness. But even in the dark, I could feel it. The presence. The pull. It was still there, waiting. And I understood, with a horrible clarity, that I was never going to leave. This place had claimed me. I woke up in the same hallway. It wasn't a sudden awakening, like a gasp or a jolt. There was no grand moment of realization. No clear delineation between sleep and waking. One moment, I was enveloped in the suffocating blackness, and the next, I was here again. In the corridor. But something was different. The walls were closer now. The air felt heavier, almost unbearable, and my body was pressed against the cold surface of the wall, my fingers trembling as they traced the rough texture. I could feel the vibrations of something, someone, moving just out of my sight, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Except for the shadows. They were alive. Have you ever felt that something's not quite right, but couldn't figure out what? I didn't know how long I had been riding the bus. It felt like hours, but the city lights outside looked exactly the same, blurry streaks of orange and yellow, casting fleeting shadows that barely registered in my mind. My eyes were tired, and I tried to focus on anything to distract me. I was on the last bus of the night, the one that took the few late commuters home. It should have been peaceful. It should have been ordinary. But it wasn't. I glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling of unease crawling up my spine. The bus was nearly empty. There was an old woman sitting a few rows ahead of me, her head bent low as if she were asleep. Another person sat near the back, hunched over, their face hidden in the dim light. I could hardly see them, but I felt their gaze on me, eyes boring into my back. The bus jolted forward, a rough stop as we hit a pothole, and I nearly lurched out of my seat. I muttered a curse under my breath, but I wasn't the only one disturbed by it. The old woman looked up suddenly, her eyes wide, and then, just as quickly, she settled back down. There was a subtle shift in the air, a crackle of tension, but no one seemed to acknowledge it. The bus driver. He didn't look like the usual guy. His hands were pale, gripping the steering wheel in a way that seemed too rigid. His posture was stiff, and his face was drawn, almost hollow. It was like he was somewhere far away, lost in a trance. I shifted in my seat, feeling the uncomfortable weight of the silence, broken only by the hum of the engine. The bus didn't seem to be making the stops it usually did. The road outside looked unfamiliar. The streets were right. I tried to convince myself I was just too tired, that I had simply lost track of where we were, but something about the route didn't match up with what I remembered. The stops weren't right either. We passed by landmarks I knew well, but the signs didn't match. The names of streets, every stop, were wrong. I turned to the woman, unsure whether to ask, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her head was down again, her shoulders hunched. I stared out the window, hoping for something familiar, but nothing came. The city outside was distorted, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond their natural reach. And then it happened. I saw the figure standing at the bus stop up ahead. Tall, too tall for a person, its shape vague but distinct. I couldn't make out details. It was only a shadow against the backdrop of the street lamp. I felt my heart speed up. The bus wasn't slowing down. It just passed the stop. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. That wasn't right. My stomach churned, and I looked to the bus driver, wanting to ask him why he hadn't stopped. But he wasn't looking forward anymore. His head was turned slightly, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. He wasn't watching the road at all. I caught my breath. His reflection in the mirror. It wasn't his reflection. There was something wrong with his face. His features were shifting, distorting, his eyes too wide, his mouth stretched in a way that didn't belong to a human face. My skin crawled as I stared, frozen in place. His eyes seemed to look straight through the mirror, straight into me. I turned away. My hands were trembling now, and I gripped the edge of my seat, trying to steady myself. I wasn't sure what was happening. Was I imagining things? Had I fallen asleep? The bus lurched again, a harsh, unnatural sound coming from the engine, and I snapped my head back toward the front. The driver was still there, his eyes back to normal, but I didn't trust it. I couldn't trust it. My breath was shallow now, and the silence in the bus was unbearable. The stops were getting stranger. The city outside felt different, warped. I looked at the map on my phone, but it was useless. The route didn't make sense anymore. None of the stops were matching up. It was like the bus wasn't in the city at all anymore. I glanced at the other passenger at the back. He hadn't moved. He was still hunched over, his face hidden. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I didn't want to look directly at him, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head. For a split second, his face was there. Right in front of me, his eyes wide, unblinking, just inches from mine. Then he blinked, and I swear I saw his mouth stretch into a grin so wide it shouldn't have been possible. I recoiled, my heart pounding. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but my words caught in my throat. The figure in front of me had disappeared. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. The bus was empty again. Just the old woman, who now sat upright, her eyes fixed on me, her expression unreadable. I looked back at the driver. His hands were still on the wheel, but he was muttering something under his breath. His voice was low, too quiet for me to hear clearly. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was the exhaustion playing tricks on me. Maybe this was all in my head. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong, and it was getting worse. I tried to focus on the rhythmic hum of the bus, but it was no use. The unease that had settled on my chest wasn't going away. It was growing, pressing against my ribs like something trying to claw its way out. The old woman hadn't moved. Her gaze never wavered, locked on me, unblinking. It was as though she could see something I couldn't. I forced myself to look away, staring instead at the empty seats ahead. The bus, which had been so ordinary at first, now felt suffocating, its stale air thick with tension. The flickering lights overhead didn't help, they buzzed in a way they shouldn't have. It was like the whole atmosphere was strained, as if the bus itself wasn't quite real. I glanced at my phone again. The route was wrong. The stops were all wrong. How could that be? This bus was supposed to take me home, straight down the main road, the one I knew by heart. But we weren't on the right path anymore. We were passing places that didn't even exist. At least, not as far as I knew. I couldn't stop staring at the map, but the more I looked, the more it seemed like it was shifting, the dots on the map moving while I wasn't looking. Was I losing my mind? Had I fallen asleep? But no, I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. The bus jerked again, and I nearly lost my balance. The windows rattled, and a cold wind rushed in through a crack, sending a chill down my spine. Something about the wind felt wrong. It wasn't just cold, it smelled strange, like metal and something sour. The kind of smell you can't ignore. I turned to the driver once more, hoping for some sign of reassurance, but he wasn't looking at the road. He was staring down at his hands on the wheel, muttering to himself. His lips moved silently, but I could make out no words. His hands, they looked wrong. Too pale. They seemed almost translucent in the dim light, and I could have sworn his fingers were moving in a way that wasn't natural, as though they weren't entirely connected to his body. I wanted to scream, to demand that he stop the bus, but I couldn't. Something stopped me. It was like my voice had been stolen. The silence in the bus had grown too thick, suffocating any attempt to break it. The old woman suddenly shifted, her head tilting slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. I looked back toward her, but she was already staring at me, her expression blank, her eyes unblinking, unfathomable. A voice broke through the tension, soft but clear, coming from the back of the bus. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I froze. It was the man at the back, the one who had been sitting hunched over. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken since I'd first noticed him. But now, his voice echoed in the stillness, sharp and disturbing. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ignore him, to convince myself I was just imagining things. But his eyes were wide open, and he was staring straight at me. That grin, The one I'd seen for just a moment before, it was there again, stretching unnaturally across his face. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean..." But before I could finish, the lights flickered violently, plunging the bus into darkness for a split second, and then they came back on, even dimmer than before. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. The man was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace at all. He hadn't moved, he had just vanished. I turned quickly to the woman beside me, desperate for some kind of validation, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her head was tilted back, and her eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, were staring up at the ceiling as if entranced by something. She didn't seem aware of anything around her. I couldn't breathe. Something was terribly wrong. The air was heavy now, thick with the feeling that we weren't alone on this bus, that there was something else here with us. The bus seemed to hum louder now, the sound vibrating in my chest, almost as if the vehicle itself was alive, pulsing with energy. The outside world had turned into an indistinguishable blur. I couldn't tell if we were still on the road, or if we were even moving at all. I pressed my face against the window, trying to make sense of the distorted shapes outside. We passed a street sign, a name I didn't recognize. I knew every street in this area, but that one was unfamiliar. And then I saw something. It wasn't a person, but a shape, standing in the shadows just beyond the light. I couldn't tell what it was, but it felt wrong, unnatural. The bus jolted again, this time more violently, and I almost fell out of my seat. I gripped the edge of the seat in front of me, my knuckles turning white. My pulse was racing now. The air in the bus was thick with dread, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the eyes of the driver, the woman, the man, they were all fixed on me, even though they weren't looking at me at all. The bus came to a sudden stop. The driver didn't speak. He didn't even move. He simply sat there, his hands on the wheel, his eyes staring straight ahead. But the hum of the engine had stopped. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. I looked around. The bus wasn't in the city anymore. The streets outside had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of darkness. The windows were now completely black, as if we were surrounded by nothing but shadows. This wasn't right. We weren't on a normal road anymore. I couldn't see anything. I had to get out. I stood up quickly, my legs shaky, and made my way to the front. The doors wouldn't open. I pulled on the handle with all my strength, but they wouldn't budge. And then, as if on cue, the voice from the back spoke again. "Where are you going?" I spun around, heart pounding. The man was back, standing just a few feet behind me, his grin stretching wider than ever. And that's when I knew I wasn't getting off this bus. Not now. Not ever. The man's grin never faltered, but there was something more to it now, something malicious. I tried to move, to escape, but my feet were frozen in place. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stared at him, my mind scrambling for an explanation, for a way out. But there was no way out. I could feel it, deep in my bones. The bus wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. I wanted to shout, to scream at him, at the driver, at anyone. But the words wouldn't come. The silence that enveloped the bus now was worse than any sound could have been. It felt as though the air itself was pressing against me, choking me with each passing second. The man took a step forward. His eyes glinted in the dim light, something darker now flickering in them. "Why are you afraid?" he asked, his voice smooth, too smooth. "There's nowhere to go. You know, I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, I stumbled back, my hand grasping for anything to steady myself. The woman beside me was still staring up, her expression blank. She was so still, like a statue, frozen in place. "Do you think this is real?" the man continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "Do you think you can just walk away from this? You can't escape." The words hit me like a cold wave, freezing my thoughts. Escape? Was that what I had been thinking? That I could just get off this bus and everything would go back to normal? But that's the thing about fear, it has a way of distorting everything. What was normal anymore? The bus was no longer moving, but I could feel it. I could feel the wheels turning, the pulse of the engine still alive, but it wasn't taking us anywhere. It was like we were suspended in time, in space, in a place that didn't belong to reality. I turned back to the driver. His face was pale, almost translucent now, and his hands on the wheel were trembling, but not from fear. No, it was something else. Something unnatural. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, but they were empty, like he was no longer in control. "Stop the bus!" I screamed, but the sound felt distant, as though I were trapped underwater. My voice echoed back at me, distorted and hollow. The man at the back chuckled, a low, unnerving sound. "Stop? There's no stopping now. You're already here." I felt my stomach lurch. What did he mean by that? Was I already here? I wanted to scream, to break down the walls of this nightmare, but the fear that gripped me held me in place. It was all I could do to keep breathing. I took a step toward the door again, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break free from this. But before I could reach the handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of a footstep behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The man was closer now, too close, his grin stretching even wider. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice now a rasping breath against my ear. "You're already part of it." I recoiled, fear flooding my system like ice water. What did that mean? Part of what? I looked around at the other passengers, hoping to find someone who could make sense of all this, but they were all the same. Silent. Frozen. Eyes wide and unblinking. They were all trapped, just like me. The world outside the bus was pure darkness now. There were no streets, no lights, no signs. Just an endless void stretching into infinity. No matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't see anything beyond the blackness. It was like the bus itself had become the only thing that existed, and everything else was gone. I couldn't take it anymore. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and my breath was shallow. My hands were trembling uncontrollably. I had to get out. I had to get away from here. I turned to the door again, pulling on the handle with all my strength. And this time, it opened. But what I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. There was no outside world. Just darkness. A swirling, endless void. No city, no night sky, just a blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. I stumbled back, falling to the floor. My breath came in ragged gasps. What is this? I cried out, but no one answered. No one moved. It was like I was the only one left with a shred of sanity. Welcome, the man said, his voice now filled with mockery. Welcome to the place where you belong. And then, the lights flickered again, But this time, they didn't come back. The bus was plunged into complete darkness. I was alone. Or was I? The whispering started then. Soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. A chorus of voices, all saying the same thing over and over again. Run. I tried to get up, to find my way out, but it was useless. The darkness closed in around me, suffocating, consuming. The voices were all around me now, and I could feel something else with me, something watching from the shadows. But I couldn't see it. I didn't need to see it. I knew it was there. And it was coming closer. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were being crushed by the weight of the darkness that surrounded me. The whispers, no, the voices, were getting louder, their words growing more frantic, more desperate. Run, they chanted. Run. 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 But where? How could I run when I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face? The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the bus itself was alive, its walls, its seats, its floor all pressing in on me. I was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. My hands scrambled for something, anything to grab onto. I needed something real. Something solid. But it all felt unreal. The bus, this place, none of it made sense anymore. I stumbled forward, my footsteps echoing in the hollow, oppressive darkness. The voices swirled around me, like they were inside my head. It's too late for you, one voice hissed. You can't escape. Another voice, softer, almost kind, whispered, you're already lost. I didn't know which way I was facing anymore. The bus, the night, time itself, everything was a blur. The air tasted bitter, like rust and something else I couldn't quite place. It was as if the very atmosphere was corrupted, infected with something I couldn't see, but could feel deep in my gut. A low, mechanical hum filled the silence, like the engine of the bus was still running. I clung to that sound, hoping that it would anchor me back to reality. But the more I listened, the more the sound twisted, distorted. It was no longer the hum of a bus engine. It was a drone, a low, guttural noise that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. I kept moving, my feet dragging, my mind reeling. Every instinct screamed at me to find the door, to get off this bus, to leave this place before whatever was hunting me caught up. But when I finally reached the door, when I tried to pull on the handle, the world around me shifted again. The floor beneath my feet wavered, like I was standing on the edge of something unstable. The walls of the bus, if that's what they were, began to warp, twisting and bending, the lines blurring, melting like wax under heat. The ceiling stretched downward, threatening to collapse. My heart was pounding so loudly that I thought it might burst from my chest. I turned, panic gripping me like icy chains. The man, the one who had been watching me, grinning, was there again, standing in the aisle. He was still smiling, but it was different now. His smile was stretched too wide, like it was forcing itself into existence. His eyes were hollow, devoid of life, and yet there was something dark, something wrong, lurking behind them. You think you can leave? He asked, his voice slow, deliberate. You think you can just walk away from all this? I backed away, my mind screaming at me to move, to do something, anything. But my body was paralyzed, stuck in place like I was being held down by an unseen force. No, I whispered, more to myself than to him. No, I can't. The man stepped closer, his movement unnaturally smooth, as though he was gliding rather than walking. Every step he took, the air around him seemed to darken, as though he was pulling the light from the space itself. "You've already made your choice," he said, his voice a low, rasping echo that seemed to come from all around me. "Now, there's no turning back." I felt the ground beneath me shift again, the bus tipping slightly, like it was tilting towards something, toward a point of no return. The air grew thicker, like I was breathing through water. My mind was racing, trying to find some explanation for what was happening, some reason why I couldn't just wake up from this madness. But there was no explanation. There was only this place. This nightmare. The man stopped a few feet away from me, and his grin widened even further. It was so wide now that it looked as though his mouth might split open, too large to be contained by his face. "You should have stayed on the bus," he said softly, almost as if he were consoling me. "But now you're one of us." I swallowed hard, trying to force the words out. What do you mean?" But before he could answer, the bus lurched again, a violent shake that threw me off balance. The walls caved in. The seats twisted and distorted. The darkness was growing, swallowing everything, and the voices, those maddening, whispering voices, grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't think anymore. I couldn't breathe. It was all closing in. There was no escape. And then, just as everything was about to collapse, everything stopped. Dead silence. The hum of the engine was gone. The darkness, the voices, the man, they all vanished. I opened my eyes. I was standing outside the bus. The world around me was quiet, too quiet. The streets were empty. The sky was a dull, gray color, like the first light of dawn, but it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The bus sat there in front of me, motionless. Its doors were wide open, as if inviting me back inside. I looked down at my feet. The ground was solid beneath me, but there was something off about it, like it was slowly crumbling away, like the earth itself was slipping through my fingers. I knew I had to leave. I had to keep running. But as I turned to walk away, I heard the softest whisper, a voice that sent ice through my veins. "Don't forget to come back." I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. The bus doors slammed shut. The sound of the bus doors slamming shut echoed in my ears, reverberating through my skull like a death knell. I stood frozen in place, staring at the vehicle that had trapped me in its nightmare once again. My legs refused to move, my body locked in terror, as the words, those chilling words, echoed in my mind, "Don't forget to come back." I didn't know how long I stood there. Minutes? Hours? Time itself had become irrelevant in this place, where reality bent and twisted like the walls of the bus. The streets around me were deserted, the world strangely quiet, like everything was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the numbness that had settled in my limbs. I needed to get away. I had to run, but where? The sense of dread that had plagued me for so long still lingered, wrapping around my chest like a vice. The pavement beneath my feet felt wrong, uneven, soft, like it was made of something that shouldn't be there. I glanced down, but there was nothing visibly out of place. The road was just an ordinary street, empty and lifeless, stretching endlessly in both directions. Then I heard it again. The bus engine. A low, mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It wasn't possible. The bus was gone. It couldn't be, but the sound, the vibrations were unmistakable. They were there, rising from the very ground beneath me. I spun around, my heart pounding. The bus had moved. Somehow, it had moved closer without a single sound, as if it had been watching me, waiting for me to make a move. Its doors were open again, and this time there was no one inside. No driver. No passengers. Only darkness. I could feel it, a pull. A strange, magnetic force drawing me toward the bus. My body wasn't my own anymore. I couldn't stop moving. My feet shuffled toward the doors, despite every instinct telling me to turn and run the other way. But I couldn't. I reached the bottom step, the darkness inside the bus swallowing me whole. My hand trembled as I gripped the cold metal railing, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn back, to escape. But it was too late. The doors slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside once again. The lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the empty seats. The engine hummed louder now, as if it were alive, breathing with me, in sync with my racing heart. And then, the driver appeared. He was standing at the front of the bus, watching me with those hollow eyes. His face was still the same, motionless, expressionless, like a mannequin. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. He simply stood there, a silent observer. I wanted to scream, to shout at him to do something, to explain what was happening. But the words stuck in my throat, suffocated by the terror that clamped down on my chest. The bus jerked forward, its wheels grinding against the pavement as it began to move once again. The world outside the windows blurred, the buildings passing by in a haze, unfamiliar, distorted. And then, the man's voice, a low, guttural whisper, filled the bus. "You're still here," he said, his voice hollow, like it came from somewhere deep within the bowels of the earth. "You've never left. You'll never leave." The words sent a shiver down my spine, but before I could react, something else caught my attention. A sound, a faint scraping, like nails on a chalkboard, coming from the back of the bus. I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. The shadows in the back corner were moving, shifting, slowly taking shape. At first, it was nothing but a dark blur, but then it solidified into a form, a figure, tall and thin, hunched over. It was impossible to make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching me, waiting for me to notice. I tried to scream, but my voice was strangled, lost in a suffocating air. The figure moved again, closer this time, its shape becoming more defined, more tangible. It was taller now, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched far too long. Its skin was gray, like rotting flesh, and its fingers were too long, too thin, as if they could snap at any moment. I backed away, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The aisle was narrow, the walls closing in on me, the air growing thicker with every breath I took. "Don't look at it," a voice whispered inside my head. "Don't look at it. You'll never escape." But it was too late. The figure was standing right in front of me now, its face inches from mine. And then it smiled. Its smile was too wide, stretching impossibly across its face, its teeth jagged and sharp. It leaned in closer, its breath foul and cold, and whispered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 others, all echoing together. "You shouldn't have come back." In that moment, everything collapsed. The world tilted, the bus spinning out of control. I fell to the floor, my vision spinning, my mind unraveling. The walls, the seats, the floor, they all melted into one dark, swirling mass. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. I reached for the door, desperate to escape, but it was gone. The exit had vanished, leaving nothing but endless darkness. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, the bus came to a sudden stop. Dead silence. I opened my eyes. I was back on the street. The same street. The same empty road. But nothing felt right. The air was thick, the sky a sickly green, and the ground, oh God, the ground was shifting like it was alive, pulling me down. The bus was gone. I turned to run, but the whispers were back. And they weren't in my head anymore. They were everywhere. Have you ever had the feeling that someone was watching you, even when you were certain you were alone? That strange sensation that crawls up your spine, making every movement feel like it's being observed? I've had that feeling for as long as I can remember, but recently it's been getting worse. Much worse. It all started about a week ago. I was walking home late from the grocery store, the night air biting at my skin as I made my way down the quiet street. It was the kind of night where everything felt still, too still. The kind of night where every footstep seems louder than it should be, and every rustle of a leaf sounds like something far more ominous. As I walked, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. But there was nothing. No one. Just the empty street stretching out in both directions. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued on my way, but it wouldn't go away. The feeling of being watched, it was there, lurking, just beyond my awareness. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. That I watched too many crime dramas and read too many thrillers. But as I reached the corner of the street, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure. Standing across the road, partially hidden by the shadows of a streetlight. At first, I thought it was just another person out for a late-night walk, but then I noticed something strange. The figure wasn't moving. It was standing completely still, just watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart began to race. I tried to look away, to convince myself that it was nothing, but my gaze kept returning to the figure. It was too tall, too thin, and there was something unsettling about the way it stood. It wasn't normal. It was almost as if it was waiting for me to notice it. And then it happened. The figure stepped forward, taking a slow, deliberate step into the light. For a brief moment, I thought I saw its face, but it was obscured, hidden in the shadow cast by the streetlight. My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned, its movements deliberate, almost mechanical. And then it was gone. Vanished into the darkness, as though it had never been there at all. I stood frozen in place, staring into the empty street where it had been, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was nothing to explain. No sound, no movement, no sign that anything unusual had happened. I walked the rest of the way home, but the unease never left me. My mind raced, questioning what I had just witnessed. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, made my heart skip a beat. I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Watching me. The next day, I thought I'd put it behind me. I went about my usual routine, running errands, meeting friends, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that clung to me. But when I walked past the same street corner, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. And there it was again. The same figure, standing in the same place, staring at me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the pavement as I hurried away from the corner, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't stop until I was back home, locked safely inside my apartment. But even then, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I knew I had to find out who or what this was. The rational part of me told me to forget about it, to not engage, but every other part of me screamed that something was terribly wrong. I started paying more attention to the strange figure. I saw it again. And again. Sometimes it would appear at the edge of my vision, lurking in the shadows, but it was always there, always watching. And with every encounter, the figure seemed closer. Its movements became more deliberate, as if it knew me, knew where I would be, what I would do. It was stalking me. I could feel it. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was watching me. Something was following me. And I was helpless to stop it. I thought about calling the police, but what could I possibly say? I think someone is following me, but I don't know who they are or why. They'd think I was crazy. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I started taking different routes home, avoiding the places where I'd seen the figure. I tried to be careful, to stay alert, but no matter what I did, it always found me. The figure was always there, lurking in the distance, waiting. And now, I'm starting to wonder, is it really just one figure? Or is it something else? Something more sinister? What if it knows me better than I know myself? What if it's not just watching, but learning? I tried everything to avoid it. Different routes, different times of day, even changing my routine completely. But every time I thought I had evaded it, I'd spot it again, always from the corner of my eye, just out of clear sight. Sometimes it was in a window across the street, sometimes it was just a shadow in the distance. But it was always there. Watching. Waiting. At first, I told myself that I was just being paranoid. That my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, how could someone know my every move? How could anyone be that present? But as the days passed, the more convinced I became that it wasn't just in my head. Something, or someone, was tracking me. One night, after another frustrating attempt to outrun whatever this was, I decided to confront it. I couldn't go on living in fear. I needed to know if this figure was real, or if I had simply lost my mind. I waited for it that evening. I didn't take my usual route. Instead, I parked myself at the old bench across from my building, where I could see the street ahead. I was determined not to let it slip by unnoticed this time. The street was eerily quiet. The usual bustle of late-night traffic had quieted down, and all I could hear was the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I checked my watch, midnight. That's when it always appeared. Like clockwork. I sat perfectly still, my heart thudding in my chest. The cool night air felt sharp against my skin, but I ignored it. I had to stay focused. I couldn't let it slip away again. Then, there it was. A shift in the shadows. A flicker of movement. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable. But then I saw it, just past the street lamp, just out of clear view, a figure. Taller than any person I'd seen before, just a silhouette in the dark. It was standing there, waiting. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I had to move. I had to approach it. Slowly, cautiously, I stood from the bench, every muscle in my body taut with fear. My breath came in shallow gasps as I took the first step toward it. My feet felt heavy, but I forced myself to move. With every step I took, the figure didn't move. It didn't flinch or turn, but I could feel its attention on me, like a weight pressing on my chest. The closer I got, the more intense the feeling became. I wasn't alone. It was there, watching me. And I was walking right into its trap. I froze mid-step. There was something wrong about this whole situation. A horrible realization hit me. What if I wasn't supposed to confront it? What if that's what it wanted? What if it was leading me right into its grasp? A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't. I was already too far in. I looked around, but there was no one else on the street. No sounds, no movement. Just the figure and me. Everything else had fallen silent. My pulse raced as I took another step forward, my eyes never leaving the dark shape. Then it moved, but not in the way a person would. The figure didn't walk or run. It seemed to glide, its shape distorting and stretching, like it was no longer bound by the rules of the physical world. The air grew cold, and I could see my breath in the chill. My legs felt like lead, as though every movement required an immense effort. But somehow, I kept moving forward. The figure shifted its form, elongating and twisting in unnatural ways, becoming something not entirely human. I couldn't comprehend what it was. It didn't make sense. It was something otherworldly, something beyond the realm of what I could possibly understand. Then, it stopped. The figure tilted its head, as if acknowledging my presence. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. It knew I was there. It had been waiting for me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, as if it was in a trance. The figure seemed to breathe, a low, disturbing sound like a rustling wind. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. For a long time, I stood there, unable to move, unable to think. The world around me seemed to return to normal. The sounds of the night slowly crept back in, the wind rustling through the leaves, the distant hum of a car's engine. But the dread that filled my chest was unshakable. I couldn't process what had just happened. What had I seen? What was that thing? My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but no answer seemed to make sense. I turned back toward my apartment, every nerve in my body screaming to look over my shoulder. I didn't want to. I knew I had to. And there it was again. The figure. It was standing in the distance, just where I had been moments ago. Watching. Waiting. I realized, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't done with me. It had just begun. The question that plagued me now wasn't why it was following me. No, the question that burned in my mind was far worse. What does it want from me? I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't just following me now, it was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. And every step I took, every choice I made, seemed to draw it closer, like a string being slowly pulled tighter around my chest. That night, I barely slept. I kept my curtains drawn tight, the blinds shut, as though that would keep whatever it was outside. But I knew, deep down, that no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. By morning, I was a mess. My thoughts were scattered, my body drained from the restless hours I had spent tossing and turning, trying to ignore the feeling that someone or something was still out there watching me. I had to get out of the apartment. I needed to clear my head to try and make sense of all of this. Maybe it was the stress of living alone for so long, or maybe I was just losing it, but I had to find a way to confront whatever this thing was. I left the apartment, heading toward the park. It was a sunny day, the kind of day where the air smells fresh, and people are out walking their dogs or sitting on benches, enjoying the quiet. It should have been comforting, but all I felt was the heavy weight of dread pressing on me. I walked aimlessly, trying to focus on the world around me. People smiled as they passed, children ran by laughing, but every sound seemed hollow, distant, as though I was in a dream and the world was slowly slipping away. My mind kept drifting back to that figure, to its unnerving stillness, to its ability to vanish without a trace. But as I reached the edge of the park, I stopped. There it was. Just ahead of me, standing at the far end of the park, partially hidden by the trees. The same tall, slender figure. The same unsettling stillness. I froze. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence. I had to approach it again. This time, I couldn't hesitate. I had to find out what it wanted, or at least get close enough to see it clearly. I walked forward, every step feeling heavier than the last. My body was shaking now, my heart thumping painfully in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. It was like some force was pulling me toward it, something I couldn't resist. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just standing there. It was holding something. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I closed the gap, I realized it was a mirror. A cracked, old mirror. The glass was dark, murky, and the edges were jagged, like the frame had been shattered and then hastily put back together. It held the mirror up toward its face, its head tilted slightly, as though it were examining something in the reflection. I wanted to scream, to turn and run as fast as I could. But my feet were rooted to the ground. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure was staring into the mirror, but its reflection wasn't right. It was twisted, warped, like the mirror was distorting its image. The face in the reflection was a grotesque, contorted version of what it should have been, eyes too wide, mouth too long, and something about it unnatural. Suddenly, the figure turned its head slowly, and I froze. It was looking at me, but its gaze was different now. It wasn't just cold and distant, there was something in its eyes. Something knowing, like it understood me in a way I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, and the world around me began to spin. The only thing I could focus on was the figure, standing so still, with that cursed mirror. I should have run then. I should have screamed. But I was rooted to the spot, frozen by the horror of it all. The figure took a step forward, and my heart pounded in my ears. Then, something changed. The mirror cracked. Not in the way a normal mirror would, but violently, like it was breaking apart from within. Pieces of glass flew in all directions, and I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding being hit. The figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked up again, the air had changed. The world had changed. The trees around me seemed darker, the sky more ominous. The people in the park had disappeared. The laughter, the chatter, it was gone. It was as if the world itself had shifted, leaving me alone with the figure. I turned to leave, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Something in the air held me back, pulling me toward the center of the park. The figure wasn't just following me anymore, it was directing me, like a puppeteer pulling the strings. I had no choice but to move forward, drawn toward it by some unseen force. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it once more. The mirror's fragments lay scattered on the ground, glistening in the dim light. And there, in the center of the broken glass, was a reflection of me. It wasn't like I expected. It wasn't just my face, my body. It was something wrong. My reflection was distorted, like it was warping in and out of focus. I looked into my own eyes, and for the briefest moment, I saw someone else in the reflection. And then the figure moved. It was faster than I could react, stepping forward, its long fingers reaching toward me. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't move. Its hand closed around my wrist, ice cold and unyielding. "You are not alone," it whispered. And everything went black. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like seconds, or maybe hours. My mind was a blur, trying to piece together the disorienting fragments of reality. The last thing I remembered was the cold touch of its hand, pulling me into darkness. Now, I was somewhere else. I blinked, slowly coming to my senses. My surroundings were unfamiliar. The park, the trees, the path I had walked down, all gone. In their place was an empty, fog-filled street, dimly lit by old streetlights that flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the ground. I could barely see my hands in front of me, but I knew I was standing. The feeling in my legs, though, was wrong, like they weren't truly mine. My feet shuffled slowly, instinctively trying to move, but my body felt numb, disconnected. The air was thick, as if it was pressing down on me from all sides. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "You're here, with me now." The voice was muffled, like it was coming from inside my own mind. But I knew it wasn't me. It wasn't my voice. I turned, my eyes scanning the dark street, desperate to find some sign of where I was. But there was nothing, no buildings, no people. Just an endless expanse of fog and shadows. Then, a shape appeared. A figure. The same tall, slender silhouette from the park, standing just at the edge of the light. It was as if it had always been there, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to notice. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape. But my legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, held captive by the overwhelming dread that gripped me. "Come closer," the voice urged, this time clearer, louder. It echoed in my ears, vibrating through my skull. "You've always been a part of this." I shook my head, desperately trying to clear my thoughts, but the words wouldn't leave me. I couldn't think straight. The figure took a slow step toward me. I could see it now, clearer than ever. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unblinking. I didn't know whether to run or stay. But in that moment, something within me snapped. A surge of adrenaline pushed me to move. I staggered back, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I moved, the figure stayed just ahead, always in the corner of my eye, never fully visible, but always there. "You can't escape," it whispered, the words like poison in my mind. "You belong here, just like everyone else." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world was shifting around me, twisting, distorting, like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. I turned down an alleyway, desperate to find something, anything, that might help me escape. The fog grew thicker, the shadows longer, and the sounds around me became more disorienting, warping into strange, unnatural noises. The whispering, the shifting, the feeling of being watched, it was all too much. My head was spinning. And then, I saw it. A door. It was cracked open, just a sliver of light spilling from inside. I rushed toward it without thinking, my fingers trembling as I grabbed the handle and yanked it open. The dim light from within barely illuminated the small, dark hallway that stretched before me. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust and the faint scent of something metallic. The room was small, cluttered with old furniture, cobwebs hung from the corners, and the walls were marked with what looked like strange symbols scratched into the paint. But what caught my eye was the mirror. It stood against the far wall, tall and cracked, the glass reflecting nothing but darkness. But as I looked closer, I could make out something in the reflection, a figure standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room. "You're here," the voice said again, louder this time, almost mocking. "You've always been here, trapped in this place." I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt colder now, like the air itself was becoming more oppressive. The whispers were getting louder, circling around me, and I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I pulled and tugged at the handle, but it was stuck. Locked. I was trapped. And then I saw it, the reflection. In the mirror, the figure was standing right behind me, its face now visible, twisted and unnaturally pale. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. It reached out, its fingers curling toward me, and I felt the air around me grow colder. "It's too late," the voice whispered. "You can't escape me." The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's hand reaching toward me, its fingers brushing against my skin. And then, nothing. No light. No sound. Just the overwhelming silence of whatever this place was. When I awoke, I was back outside. The fog was gone, the streetlights no longer flickered, and everything was eerily still. But something was different. The air felt heavier, and the silence was deafening. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the fog that clung to my mind, but the unease gnawed at me. Was it real? Was any of it real? I looked around. The street I stood on was familiar, but somehow off. The buildings were there, but the shapes of them seemed wrong, as if they were painted onto the world, unsettling, unreal. The trees lining the sidewalks, once comforting in their natural disorder, now looked like dark figures, standing still and watching. I reached for my phone, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the screen. No service. The battery was almost dead, as if whatever had happened had drained it. There was no record of anything, no text, no calls. Just a blank screen staring back at me. A strange, dull thud echoed in the distance, pulling my attention away from the phone. I turned toward the sound. At first, it was distant, like someone walking. But then it grew louder, closer. I froze. The footsteps were unmistakable. Someone, or something, was coming toward me. I backed up slowly, my feet dragging against the pavement, my body moving of its own accord. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows at the end of the street. Something was there. I could feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of what I could see. And then it appeared. The figure. It stood there, as it had before, at the far end of the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me, watching me. I could feel its gaze even from this distance. My skin prickled, my heart raced. It didn't move at first. It just stood there. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, to think rationally. But every part of me screamed to run. My mind screamed to flee, to escape the terror that was closing in on me. But my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the fear that had seeped deep into my bones. The figure took a step forward, and then another. With each movement, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. My chest tightened as I tried to force myself to move, to take a single step, but I couldn't. My legs were like lead. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered to the figure, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking aloud or just to myself. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It never did. But I could feel its presence, suffocating, closing in on me. My breath came in shallow gasps as it drew closer, and I could feel my pulse racing, a frantic rhythm in my ears. It stopped in front of me, so close that I could see the faint outline of its face, barely visible in the dark. The skin was pale, unnaturally so, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes, they were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow everything in their path. And then, a voice, a low, gravelly whisper that came from deep within my chest, as if the words were clawing their way out. "You can't run from me." My body tensed. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I felt trapped, caught in a nightmare that was unfolding in real time. The figure reached out, its hand hovering inches from my face. Its fingers were long and thin, like claws, and as it moved closer, I could feel the cold radiating off it. The air seemed to freeze around its touch, a sharp, biting chill that made my breath catch. "You belong to me now," it whispered. "You always have." The words echoed in my mind, reverberating in the emptiness that surrounded us. I was losing myself, losing control of everything I thought I knew. Without thinking, I took a step back, then another and another, until I was running. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the street, away from the figure that now seemed to chase me, following my every move. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to. The only thing that mattered was getting away. The pavement beneath my feet seemed to stretch on forever, the world spinning around me as I ran. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, it was always there. The figure. Watching. Waiting. I rounded a corner, my heart pounding in my chest, when I collided with something, or someone. I stumbled back, my hands held up in defense, ready to fight. But when I looked up, I saw nothing. No figure. Just the empty street. It was gone. I stood there, breathing heavily, unsure of what had just happened. Had it been real? Was I losing my mind? I glanced over my shoulder. The street was empty, silent. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. And the worst part? I couldn't remember how I'd gotten here. I didn't know how much time had passed, how long I had been running. The memories, if they were even memories, were fragments slipping through my fingers like sand. And there, in the corner of my mind, I could still hear the whispering voice. The voice of the figure. "You belong to me now." Have you ever walked into a place that feels wrong from the moment you step inside? You can't explain it, nothing is visibly out of place, but something deep inside you whispers that this is not where you should be. That was how I felt as I stood in front of the old school building, its decaying brick walls casting long shadows under the dull, overcast sky. The wind howled through the broken windows, a mournful cry that seemed to reach into the very core of my being. I had heard the stories, of course. The school had been abandoned for years after the tragic fire that took the lives of several students. They said the place was cursed, that the spirits of the lost children still roamed its halls, searching for a way to escape the horrors that trapped them there. But what really pulled me and my friends here wasn't just the stories, it was the thrill of the unknown, the lure of something forbidden. There were 5 of us, friends, all with different reasons for wanting to explore the old building. I was the most hesitant, but the others had convinced me. They had all heard the rumors about the school, about the things that happened in the dead of night, when the walls seemed to breathe and the floorboards creaked under the weight of unseen footsteps. We didn't know exactly what we were expecting to find, but we were all certain that we wanted to see it for ourselves. The moment we stepped across the threshold, I felt it, a shift in the air. It wasn't just the coolness of the building, it was something else, something deeper, a presence that seemed to watch us as we made our way down the darkened hallway. Is this really a good idea? I whispered to Josh, my closest friend. He gave me a look, one of those half smiles that he always wore when he was excited about something dangerous. Come on, Emma, he said. Nothing's going to happen. It's just an old building. I wasn't so sure. I could feel it. The weight of the place. The silence, so thick it pressed against my chest. And the air, there was a strange smell, like damp wood mixed with something metallic. It made me feel lightheaded. We wandered deeper into the school, the creaking floorboards the only sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the faint outlines of chalk marks still lingered on the blackboards. But it wasn't the decay that unsettled me, it was the sense that we weren't alone. The others laughed, their voices bouncing off the empty halls, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every now and then, I'd hear something, footsteps, a whisper, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to nerves, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of being watched. We reached the gymnasium eventually, the largest room in the school, and the one that seemed to hold the most energy, if you could call it that. The doors groaned as they swung open, revealing the dark, cavernous space. The floor was covered in dust, but once vibrant markings for basketball courts now faded and barely visible. Let's split up, Josh suggested, his voice echoing too loudly in the vast room. We'll find something cool. I didn't want to, but I followed along. There was no real reason to stay close. No real danger. It was just a stupid old school, right? I wandered into the locker rooms, the smell of mildew thick in the air. The lockers were rusted, some of them hanging off their hinges. I ran my hand along the cold metal, feeling a chill shoot up my spine. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps from the others. But as I turned a corner, I felt something brush against the back of my neck. I spun around, heart racing, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Just the dark shadows stretching across the walls. But something was different. The air had changed again, heavier, thicker. I glanced back toward the door, wondering if I should just leave. But then a low whisper floated through the air, so soft I thought I might have imagined it. Get out. The words froze me in place. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to move, my feet dragging as I backed away from the shadowy hallway. I turned and sprinted back to the gymnasium, heart pounding in my chest. But as I approached, something was wrong. The others, they were gone. Josh? I called out, my voice shaking. Lena? Paul? Nothing. I felt a sudden rush of panic. This wasn't right. I had to find them. The gymnasium felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in on me. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The doors that we had entered through were gone. Just empty walls where they had once been. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? It was hard to tell in this place where time seemed to lose its meaning. But I wasn't alone anymore. I could hear them now. Soft, shuffling footsteps. Behind me. Too close. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. And then I saw it. A shadow moving just out of my reach. Something tall and thin, its outline flickering in the dim light. Who's there? I called out, my voice a mix of fear and defiance. What do you want? No answer. Just more footsteps. Closer now. And then, the whisper. Louder this time. Get out, before it's too late. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing deeper, darker. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the air felt thick with the weight of something watching, waiting. I wasn't sure how long I could stand it. How long before the walls of this cursed school swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of those footsteps, slow, deliberate, was the only thing I could focus on. Every second felt like an eternity, stretching out as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I took a shaky breath, trying to force myself to move, but my body felt like it was locked in place. The whispering voices were louder now, all around me, pressing in on my ears like a swarm of angry bees. I couldn't make out the words, just the sound of desperation, of something trying to reach me. But I didn't dare turn around. Please, I whispered to myself, please let this be over. A sudden crash from behind made me flinch. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. The gymnasium was empty. The shadows were still there, shifting and stretching, but the others, Josh, Lena, Paul, were nowhere to be found. My hands shook as I searched the room, my eyes wide, darting from corner to corner. The once familiar space was now a cavernous, darkened pit, and the weight of the silence was unbearable. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be alone. I started walking, the floor creaking beneath my steps. I don't even know where I was going anymore. I just had to move. Away from the whispers. Away from the feeling that something was following me, inching closer with every step. But the shadows weren't the only thing I had to worry about. From the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. A figure. Not one of my friends. It was tall, thin, its limbs too long, almost unnatural. It was crouched in the farthest corner of the gym, its form blending into the darkness, just barely visible. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught. It didn't move at first, just watched me with eyes that I couldn't quite make out. But I could feel it. Watching me. Waiting. And then it moved. Fast. Before I could even react, it lunged towards me. My feet barely had time to move as I scrambled backward, but the thing was already there, right in front of me. Its face was a twisted mockery of humanity, pale, gaunt skin stretched tight over its skull, eyes hollow, empty. It opened its mouth, a sound like rustling leaves coming from deep within its chest. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, panic flooding my veins. "Run!" I screamed, but my voice didn't sound like my own. It was too small, too helpless. The figure didn't respond, except for a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the room. And then it lunged again. I turned and bolted for the door, the exit, the only thing I could think of. I heard it behind me, footsteps too fast, too heavy, gaining on me with every second. My mind screamed at me to move faster. But my body was betraying me. My legs felt like lead, my breaths ragged and shallow. The doors, they were right in front of me, but they were locked. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I screamed in frustration, panic spiraling out of control. The thing was closer now. I could hear its breath, ragged, wet, and thick, like something alive and dying at the same time. I slammed my shoulder against the door, but it didn't give. I was trapped. Then, as if some higher power had finally taken pity on me, the door suddenly swung open, its hinges creaking with a loud groan. Without thinking, I dashed through the doorway, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The hallway stretched before me, dark and suffocating, but it felt like the only path I had left. My pulse was in my ears, my thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. I wasn't sure where I was heading, just that I couldn't stay in that room. I couldn't stay near the thing that was hunting me. I rounded a corner, stumbling into a small, dimly lit classroom. It was a strange place to end up, familiar, but wrong. The desks were still in neat rows, though the blackboard was cracked and covered in a thick layer of dust. The room smelled faintly of chalk and mildew, but it didn't feel like a classroom anymore. It was different. And that's when I heard it. A voice. Not from behind me. Not from in front. But from somewhere within the walls. Low and calm, as though it was speaking directly into my mind. "Run, Emma. It's already too late." I froze. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice wasn't my imagination. It was real. It was here. The room had changed. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing in time with my frantic heartbeat. The windows were dark now, as if the light outside had been swallowed whole. I backed away from the wall, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of a desk. The faint sounds of movement returned, but this time they weren't just footsteps. It was as if the entire school had come alive, watching, waiting for me to make my next move. Something was in the walls. I could hear it now, scratching, scraping. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to wonder if it was real. All I could think was that I had to get out. And I wasn't alone anymore. The scratching in the walls grew louder, closer, as though something, or someone, was crawling through the narrow spaces between the plaster. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a painful reminder of how trapped I truly was. The only door out of the classroom was now the most intimidating thing in the world. But I couldn't stay here. I knew that. I moved slowly at first, my breath ragged, trying to keep as quiet as possible. Every creak of the floor beneath my feet felt like an alarm going off, but I had no choice. The classroom was a dead end. The thing in the walls, it wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real. I could hear it breathing now, its ragged, wet inhalations like a low growl seeping through the walls. I edged toward the door, barely daring to touch the handle. I had to get out. But what was waiting for me on the other side? I hesitated, fear freezing me in place once again. The air around me seemed thick, suffocating, as if the very space was pressing in on me. The scratching stopped. I didn't know if that meant it was gone or if something worse was coming. But then, just as I was about to reach for the door, it opened. I didn't expect it. It should have been locked. My pulse spiked. But when the door swung open with a slow creak, I realized, almost too late, that it wasn't a person who opened it. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood in the doorway. It wasn't human, not in the way that we understand humanity. Its eyes were dark, empty voids, and its skin stretched too tight over the bones of its face. It wasn't breathing. It was watching me, unmoving, silent. I took a step back. Another. Then, the voice came again. "Emma, you should have never come here." I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The thing in front of me didn't move at first, but then its mouth split open, wide, unnaturally wide, and I heard the same scratchy whisper from before. The walls themselves seemed to shudder with the sound, vibrating as though they, too, were alive. "Why are you here?" "You shouldn't be here," the thing rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping across the floor. I didn't know what it wanted. Didn't know if it was even possible to fight whatever this was. But the fear inside me reached its peak, and I wasn't going to wait to find out what would happen next. My hand shook as I grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood that had once been part of the desk, and held it in front of me like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, even though I knew how futile it was. It didn't respond, just stood there, its black eyes boring into me. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think straight. I had to get out. And somehow, the thought of the stairwell, of leaving the floor, pushed me forward. I shoved past the figure, narrowly avoiding its cold touch. The air around me shifted, as though the room itself was angry that I had moved, but I didn't care. I didn't stop to look back. I ran. The hallway outside was no better. It stretched out before me, long and narrow, like some twisted labyrinth. The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the heavy silence, but I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, to pulse, as if they were alive, watching me. I felt it then. That suffocating weight pressing down on me. The school was alive, breathing, shifting as though it had its own will. The walls seemed to close in on me as I ran. Every hallway, every corner felt the same, disorienting, endless. But then, I saw it. At the end of the corridor, another figure, crouching low to the ground. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, like a presence I couldn't escape. It wasn't one of my friends. It wasn't a person at all. It was something else. Something far worse. I tried to turn, to run in the opposite direction, but the walls had already closed in behind me. There was nowhere to go. The thing in front of me stood up slowly, its limbs long and unnaturally stiff. It tilted its head, almost curiously. The whispering started again, quiet at first, then louder. I couldn't understand it. My mind couldn't process the words, the sounds. I only felt them, crawling under my skin. Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. The walls around me began to shift, not just physically, but in ways I couldn't explain. The air grew thick, suffocating. The shadows began to twist, and I could hear faint laughter, distant but unmistakable. I pressed my back to the nearest door, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of the nightmare that was swallowing me whole. It was all too much. All of it was happening too fast. There was no escape. The voices, the laughter, the whispers, they were closing in on me. I closed my eyes, heart racing, every instinct telling me to scream, to run, but my body felt too heavy to move. And then I heard it. A voice. Not from the thing in front of me. Not from the walls. But from behind me. Emma, you're not the first. The ground seemed to tilt beneath me. My vision blurred as the shadows reached out, swallowing everything around me. I wasn't the first, but I wouldn't be the last. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but the darkness pressed in, suffocating. The laughter faded into a low hum, vibrating through the walls as though the building itself was alive, breathing, reacting to my terror. I could barely feel my legs, numb from the cold sweat that dripped down my spine. I didn't want to look behind me. I couldn't. But that voice, it had come from someone, or something, standing just out of sight. My heart beat faster, each thought a reminder that time was running out. Emma, you're not the first. The words echoed in my ears, over and over, like a terrible chant. But what did it mean? I wasn't the first to do what? To step into this cursed place? To try to escape it? I forced myself to turn around, my pulse thundering in my neck, but the hallway was empty. Or at least, it appeared to be. The shadows stretched, distorting the walls into strange, unnatural shapes. The windows, once covered in grime, now looked impossibly clear, but they didn't show the outside. Instead, they reflected only more of the empty hallway, an endless loop of despair. My breath hitched as I took a hesitant step forward. The figure, no, the thing, was gone. But the oppressive silence was worse than the screams of terror I expected to hear. I could feel the weight of its presence behind me, hovering, watching, but when I turned again, nothing was there. I had to keep moving. There was no other choice. I stumbled down the hallway, my feet moving before my mind could process what was happening. It felt as though the walls were shifting, changing, pushing me forward, making me go deeper into this nightmare. I reached for the nearest door, almost frantic, but my fingers grazed the cold metal handle, and the door didn't open. It was locked. Everything was locked. The whole place felt like a trap, and I was the prey. I heard a shuffle to my left, and my heart jumped. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing there, just the hollow sound of my own breathing, too loud in the silence. But then, something moved. From the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure darting across the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. My first instinct was to run after it, to find my friends, to ask if they saw it too. But my legs refused to move. The terror was paralyzing. The shadows at the far end of the hall shifted again, longer now, stretching across the floor like claws reaching for me. I could almost hear them scrape along the ground. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my nerves, but the fear in my chest was too thick. The air was too heavy. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just had to get out. I turned toward the stairwell, hoping to escape, hoping that the door was open. But when I reached the staircase, I stopped dead. There, on the bottom step, sat something that made my stomach churn. A child's doll, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing, the other staring blankly up at me. Its clothes were tattered, and it sat there, perfectly still, like it had been placed deliberately. The doll. The doll had not been there a moment ago. My blood ran cold. There was something about it, something that made my skin crawl. This place, it wasn't just a building. It was alive. And it knew I was here. I reached down, my hand shaking uncontrollably, but just as I was about to touch it, a voice, my voice, whispered in my ear. Don't. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, and yet I could feel the oppressive weight of something watching me, something lurking in the dark. I pulled my hand back quickly, not daring to move any closer to the doll. The silence was deafening, but it was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being suffocated. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I ran. The stairs felt endless, each step heavier than the last. But then, I heard something. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder. Footsteps. It wasn't my own. I froze. The footsteps weren't just following me, they were getting closer. I dared not turn around, but I could feel them now, breathing down my neck, each footstep closer than the last. I ran faster, but the hallways twisted. The doors were locked. Every corner turned was another dead end. The whole building was alive with that sickening hum, like a pulse, a heartbeat that didn't belong to anything human. And with every step I took, I felt it grow stronger, more real. I stopped in front of a door that seemed to appear out of nowhere. A door I hadn't seen before. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, and it turned easily. I slammed it open and stepped into the room. Darkness. Silence. But then, a low laugh echoed from the shadows. Not the walls. Not the building. From the corner of the room. Welcome to your new home, the voice rasped. The door slammed shut behind me. The room was suffocating, darker than any darkness I had ever known. The air itself felt thick, as though it was pressing against my skin, forcing me to stay still. I couldn't even tell if my eyes were open anymore. Everything was a blur of shadows and uncertainty. I tried to breathe, but the air tasted stale, foul, as if the room had been sealed for years. I didn't know how long I had been standing there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice, the laugh that had come from nowhere, still echoed in my mind, replaying over and over like a curse. Welcome to your new home. The words reverberated through the room, bouncing off the walls, multiplying in my head. I couldn't stop them. They were too loud. Too real. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on something sharp, metallic. I barely felt it, but when I looked down, I saw an old, rusted chair tipped over on the floor. A pile of torn, yellowed papers sat beneath it. I tried to move away, but a cold wind suddenly swept through the room, slamming the door behind me. I was trapped. The laughter was louder now. Closer. It sounded like it was coming from all directions, a mocking, twisted sound that seemed to fill every corner of the room. I turned around in a panic, but there was nothing there. Only shadows. Only silence, broken by that eerie, distant sound of laughter. My hands gripped my head as I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. It was as though it had wormed its way into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, it wouldn't stop. I'm losing my mind, I whispered to myself, the words leaving my mouth as if they were my only connection to reality. But then the room seemed to shift. The shadows that had once been so still were now moving, stretching, contorting like they were alive. I didn't know if I was seeing things or if the room was truly changing, but everything around me felt wrong. I had to leave. I had to get out before it swallowed me whole. The walls began to pulse, each beat matching the rhythm of my heart. The light, what little light there was, flickered and dimmed, casting long, unnatural shadows across the floor. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I touched the handle. Locked. It wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. I wasn't alone. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. There was something in the room with me. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it, a presence, so strong it was almost suffocating. It was in the air, in my lungs, in my bones. And then, from the far corner of the room, a shape started to emerge from the shadows. At first, it was a mere distortion, a shifting of the dark. But as it moved forward, it began to solidify, becoming more and more distinct. A figure. A person? It was a silhouette at first, nothing more than a vague shape against the backdrop of darkness. But as it grew closer, I could see details. A face. No face. It was there, but it wasn't. It was a blur of features, a face that refused to be understood, like a jumbled mess of human-like traits twisted together in a grotesque pattern. I could hear it breathing, low and raspy, and I realized, too late, that it wasn't alone. There were others. The shadows, once still, now crawled across the floor, wrapping around my legs, dragging at my feet. The room seemed to pulse with them, like the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting with every movement. Get away from me! I screamed, but the words were lost in the overwhelming noise, the laughter, the whispers. They were all around me now. I tried to run, but my feet were stuck to the floor, glued by the cold, the shadows, the grip of whatever these things were. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel them pressing in, getting closer. Their presence was overwhelming, like they were inside me, filling my head, pushing everything else out. I could hear their voices now, rising above the laughter, whispering in the same distorted tone. You shouldn't have come. You'll never leave. You're one of us now. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My chest tightened, the air growing thinner with each passing second. The room was spinning, the walls closing in, and the shadows were everywhere. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to block it all out, but it was useless. They were inside my mind now, crawling beneath my skin. I could feel them in my thoughts, in my soul. And then I heard a voice, soft, like a breath on my ear. A familiar voice. Emma. It was her. Lily's voice. I shot my head up, my heart pounding. I searched the room frantically, but there was nothing. No sign of Lily, no sign of anyone. Lily? I whispered, almost not daring to believe it. But nothing answered. The door. I had to get to the door. I ran, no. I stumbled toward the exit, my legs heavy and uncooperative. The laughter and the whispers followed me, louder now, and the shadows were everywhere. I could feel them reaching for me, trying to pull me back into the dark, to drag me down with them. Just when I reached for the handle again, a hand grabbed my arm. Cold. Unnaturally cold. I turned, and for the first time, I saw them clearly. Faces. Hundreds of faces, twisted and contorted in agony, staring at me from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. They were everywhere, their mouths open, their eyes wide with silent screams. Their hands stretched out, clawing at me, begging, pulling. And then everything went black. It started with a simple question. Why wouldn't the window open? I'd been staying in this room for a few weeks, renting it from an older woman who lived on the first floor. It was a quiet building, tucked away in a narrow street, surrounded by trees and the occasional distant sound of passing traffic. It felt safe. It felt ordinary. Except there was something about that room, something small and unsettling. The window. It was an old, narrow thing, painted shut with layers of chipped white paint. The frame was thick with dust, and the glass was speckled with water stains. But when I first moved in, I assumed that a good push would be enough to open it. It didn't budge. I wasn't too worried at first. Old windows can be stubborn. A little persistence, some extra force, and it would be fine. But after several attempts, I started to wonder why it wouldn't open. The more I tried, the more I felt like something was wrong. It wasn't just that the window wouldn't open. It was the feeling it gave me, the strange sense of being trapped. As though the outside world, just beyond that glass, had been cut off. Each time I approached the window, I noticed the same thing. The room grew quieter. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking of the clock on the wall, everything seemed to fade while I stood in front of it. And yet, when I finally turned away and walked back to the center of the room, the sounds returned as if they had never stopped. It was disorienting, but I didn't think too much of it. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling. Something was off. The house, the woman who owned it, everything was too quiet. I had met her only once, when I signed the lease, and she barely spoke. She lived alone, she said, and that was all I needed to know. She didn't seem to care much for conversation or company, which suited me just fine. But now, in the silence of my room, I felt a strange unease growing inside me. On the third night, I decided to try again. I walked over to the window and pressed my hands against the cool glass. I pushed with all my weight, grunting with the effort, but it remained stubbornly sealed. I leaned in closer, squinting to see if there was something blocking it, but all I could see was a sliver of night beyond the glass. The streetlights outside cast long shadows across the pavement, but everything was still. Too still. I heard a creak. Soft, almost imperceptible. I froze. The creak came again, louder this time, like the sound of a door slowly opening. But I was the only one in the room. I turned toward the source of the sound, my breath shallow, heart pounding. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, moving in the dim light. Nothing was there. Of course, nothing was there. I laughed softly to myself, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had begun to creep up my spine. Maybe it was just the wind outside. Maybe it was just the house settling, the old wooden floors groaning under the weight of time. But then I heard something else. A whisper. Faint, almost like a sigh, drifting through the still air. I turned back to the window. The glass looked darker now, as though the outside world had been swallowed by the night. I couldn't explain it. The whisper. The way the room felt colder. The way the silence seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on me. But there was something about that window, the way it wouldn't open, the way it seemed to trap me inside, that felt wrong. I stepped away from the window, my heart still racing. I looked around the room, feeling a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The walls seemed to be closing in, the shadows growing darker with every passing second. I needed to calm down. I needed to clear my head. But then I saw it. On the floor, near the edge of the window, something glinted in the dim light. A small, metal object. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. I bent down, squinting. It was a key. A key. I didn't remember seeing it there before, and I couldn't remember when it had appeared. It was old, tarnished, but there was no mistaking it. It was a key, but for what? There were no doors in the room that I didn't have access to. I didn't need another key. I reached down to pick it up, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. A shiver ran through me, but I quickly stood, clutching the key in my hand. I didn't know what it meant or why it had appeared. But something told me that the key, like the window, wasn't just a random object. It was a part of something bigger, something I didn't understand. Something that had been waiting for me to find it. I turned back toward the window, my mind racing. What was beyond that glass? Why couldn't I open it? I walked slowly toward it again, key in hand, trying not to look too closely at the shadows in the corners of the room. But as I approached the window, the same oppressive stillness returned, heavier this time. The hum of the refrigerator had stopped again, and the ticking of the clock was gone. Only the whispering wind outside filled the silence. I pressed my hand against the window, my fingers brushing the cool surface, feeling that strange unease wash over me again. And that's when I noticed it. The window, it wasn't just sealed shut. It was sealed in a way that shouldn't be possible. The edges of the frame were wrong, dented in a way that didn't make sense. It was as if the window had been locked into place, not by something natural, but by something unnatural. My breath caught in my throat. Something was on the other side. And it was watching me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispering, feel the presence on the other side of the glass. The key sat on my bedside table, glinting in the dim light as though it had a life of its own. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the window was just old. Maybe the key had fallen from somewhere else, another tenant, perhaps. But the feeling in the room, the heavy silence, was not something I could easily dismiss. By morning, the air in the room felt thick, stagnant. I could hardly breathe, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I glanced at the window, still sealed tight, its surface gleaming unnaturally clean despite the grime around the frame. The shadows outside were darker than they had been the night before, and for a moment, I wondered if they had always been like that. I had to get out. I pulled myself out of bed, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled deep in my bones. The room looked the same creaky floorboards, same faded wallpaper. But it didn't feel the same. It felt like it was closing in, like something was coming closer. I couldn't shake the thought that the window wasn't just sealed. It was meant to be sealed. I grabbed my jacket and headed downstairs, desperate to clear my mind. The old woman who owned the building was nowhere to be found, as usual. It was just me in the house, which seemed to be getting more and more oppressive with each passing day. I walked around the block, trying to breathe in the fresh air, but it wasn't enough. My head throbbed, my thoughts raced. What was going on? Why did I feel so trapped? It was only when I came back to the house that I noticed something new. The door to the basement was slightly ajar. I had never seen it open before. The door was old, with chipped paint and a heavy lock, the kind that made a deep, resonating sound when it was turned. I had assumed it was locked, like everything else in the house that had been abandoned over the years. But now, it was open. I walked toward it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The faint smell of something damp and musty wafted from the darkness below. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should venture into the unknown. But something in me, something dark and curious, urged me to step forward. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The basement was colder than I expected, and the air felt heavier. The shadows seemed to move unnaturally, flickering as if they had a life of their own. I fumbled for the light switch, finally finding it, but the light bulb above me flickered weakly, casting the room in a pale, sickly glow. The basement was full of old furniture, boxes stacked high, and forgotten belongings. But there, in the far corner of the room, something caught my eye. A mirror. It was large, leaning against the wall, its glass dusty but still reflecting the dim light. I felt drawn to it. I didn't know why, but something about it felt important. I stepped closer, staring at my reflection. But as I did, I realized that something was wrong. My reflection seemed off. The room behind me, the one I knew so well, was gone. Instead, there was darkness, like an endless void, stretching behind me. I blinked. The reflection returned to normal. Or was it normal? I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The darkness was still there, creeping along the edges of the mirror. I leaned closer, my face nearly pressed against the glass, when I saw it. A figure, standing just behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the empty basement. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there. It was watching me. My breath caught in my throat. It was a shape, faint, almost formless, but there was something undeniably wrong about it. The figure was distorted, its features hidden in shadow. It seemed to grow, to stretch, its limbs elongating unnaturally. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. The basement, the mirror, the figure, it was all too much. I needed to leave. But as I turned to flee, I heard something from the darkness of the basement. A voice. Faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. Help me. I froze. My body went cold, my thoughts scattered. The voice was soft, but it sounded desperate, as if it had been calling out for years. I took a step back, my feet unsteady. The whisper came again, louder this time. Please. I turned and ran up the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty house. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily. My mind was racing. What had I just heard? What had I seen? The basement. The mirror. The voice. I glanced at the window again. It seemed to be staring at me, waiting. The key. It was still on the table. I walked over to it slowly, feeling the weight of it in my palm. It was cold. Heavier than I remembered. I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening, whatever was on the other side of that window, wasn't normal. And I had to find out what it was. But the question remained, why couldn't I open the window? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air around me felt thick, like it was pushing against my skin. The room, which had once felt so familiar, now felt alien, as if it was no longer a place of safety but a cage. The key still sat on the table. I hadn't touched it since I'd picked it up. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of the mirror in the basement, the voice, and the dark figure I'd seen or thought I saw just behind me. I had to do something. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to the window. There was something in my gut telling me that whatever was happening had something to do with it. I couldn't ignore the sense of urgency that gripped me, like I was running out of time. I walked over to the window, my breath catching in my throat. It was as if the room had become a vacuum, pulling me closer with every step. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the glass. The darkness outside was suffocating now, more oppressive than before. It wasn't just the absence of light, it felt wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch toward the window, like dark tendrils trying to crawl inside. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cool surface. The glass felt even colder than before, unnaturally so. I turned the key, but the window didn't budge. I tried again, pressing harder, but it remained stubbornly sealed. Panic started to creep into my chest. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. I stepped back, my mind racing. What was keeping it shut? Why couldn't I open it? Was it the house, or was it something else? Something more. The whispering voice from the basement echoed in my mind. Help me. The words sent a chill down my spine. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners began to shift. I could feel the presence again, like something was moving just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I rushed to the door and flung it open, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the room. The hallway outside was silent, eerily so, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was holding its breath, waiting. I walked down the hall toward the stairs, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. It felt like it was calling to me, like something was waiting on the other side. The more I tried to ignore it, the more insistent it became. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in this house with these things. But I couldn't do it alone. I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in weeks. Hello? The voice on the other end was groggy. It was a friend, someone I had known for years but hadn't seen in a long time. They had always been there for me, even when I wasn't sure I deserved it. I need help, I said, my voice trembling. What's wrong? They asked, sounding more awake now. I don't know. Something's happening. In the house. The window, it won't open. And there's something outside. Something in the dark. I can't explain it, but it's coming closer. There was a long pause on the other end. You're scaring me, they finally said. Why don't you just leave the house for a while? Come stay with me. I shook my head, but they couldn't see it. I can't. There's something here. Something that won't let me go. I need to figure out what's going on. I need to get out, but I don't think I can without understanding what's happening. Okay, they said slowly, their voice tinged with worry. I'll come over. Stay where you are. I'll be there soon. I ended the call and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm that was raging inside me. I had to wait. But how long could I wait before it was too late? Before whatever was out there crossed the threshold? The door to my room slammed shut behind me, and I froze. I hadn't closed it. I was certain of it. My pulse quickened as I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. I walked toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. The air had changed again. It felt wrong, thick, suffocating. I turned, expecting to see the hallway empty, but there was something there. A shadow. It was stretched across the wall, unnatural in its length, its shape twisted in a way that defied logic. I stared at it, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The shadow seemed to grow, as if it were alive, reaching toward me. I couldn't move. Then it spoke. Leave. The voice was guttural, distorted. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow loomed larger, the air around me growing colder. I could feel it closing in, pressing against me, suffocating me. I backed away, fumbling for the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. The door was stuck, jammed shut. The shadow stepped forward, its form becoming clearer. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure, its outline twisted and contorted, its face nothing but a void of darkness. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. But then, the figure stopped. It tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, it spoke again, its voice a low, rasping whisper that sent chills crawling down my spine. The window won't open. Not until you understand. The room grew colder. The walls seemed to press in closer. The figure was gone, but its words echoed in my mind. I was more lost than ever. I couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating any hope I had left. The shadow was gone, but it had left a mark, an impression on the walls of my mind that would not fade. The room felt smaller now, as if it were closing in on me. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air was thick with something I couldn't name, something cold and suffocating. The silence was broken only by the erratic beating of my heart, and I could feel the floor beneath me begin to tilt, the ground shifting like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I stumbled back from the door, my hands trembling as I wiped the sweat from my forehead. The window, the shadow, the voice, they were all connected. I could feel it. But how? What was the meaning behind it all? And why couldn't I escape? I glanced around the room, desperate for something that could explain what was happening. The furniture, so familiar just days ago, looked strange now, as if it belonged to someone else. The desk, the bed, the chair, they felt wrong, like they were watching me, waiting for something. I looked back at the window. It was the only thing that seemed untouched by the creeping madness around me. The only thing that remained constant. But no matter how many times I tried, it still wouldn't open. I gritted my teeth and approached it again. The coldness of the glass bit into my fingers as I gripped the frame, turning the key again with all my strength, desperate to break free. Nothing. Not a single movement. The window won't open, not until you understand. The words from the shadow echoed in my mind once more. It was as if they had become a part of me now, insistent, relentless. But what was there to understand? I was alone in this house. No one knew what I was going through. And yet, there was something I was missing. Something important hidden just beneath the surface. I stepped away from the window, my chest tight. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavier now, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I glanced at the door. I had to get out. I had to break free from whatever grip this place had on me. But something stopped me. A noise. A soft scuffing sound coming from the hallway. It was barely audible at first, like the soft shuffle of feet across the floor, but it grew louder, closer. My heart leaped in my chest. I held my breath. The scuffling stopped abruptly, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, the kind that makes every inch of your body scream that something is wrong. I felt a cold draft behind me. I turned slowly, eyes wide, dreading what I might see. The door was still shut, but the air, it felt different. The temperature had dropped so much that I could see my breath misting in the air. The darkness outside the window had deepened, swallowing up the light. I stepped back, unsure of what to do next. That's when I saw it. A crack. A tiny, hairline crack in the glass. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. I had never noticed it before. I moved closer, my fingers hovering over it, and as I touched the glass, I felt a strange tingling sensation, a sharp, electric jolt that shot through my fingertips and up my arm. The crack expanded. My pulse quickened. The crack spread across the glass like a web, branching out in every direction. It seemed to grow faster with each passing second, as though the window itself was alive, responding to some unseen force. The air grew even colder, and I could hear the faintest of whispers, just at the edge of hearing. "You're close, so close." I recoiled, stumbling back from the window. The crack had grown larger, almost as if the window was beginning to fracture, breaking apart in slow motion. But that wasn't the only thing I noticed. The shadows outside the window, they were moving. They were swirling, twisting together, forming shapes that weren't quite right. They were shifting, undulating, like a mass of liquid darkness, and they seemed to be coming closer to the house. To me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. I couldn't make a sound. I backed away from the window, heart pounding in my chest. The door still wouldn't open. The air still felt thick, oppressive, and I could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You need to understand." The words echoed in my mind again, as though they were coming from all directions. The house was alive, pulsating with the need for me to understand. But I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what I was supposed to understand. Suddenly, the glass shattered. The sound was deafening. The fragments of glass exploded outward, scattering across the room. I stumbled backward, hands raised to shield my face as the sharp edges cut into the air. But even as the glass fell to the floor in a glittering rain, I felt no relief. The shadowy figures outside had not dissipated. If anything, they were closer now, pressing against the window frame, their shapes becoming clearer. And then, I saw it. A face. It wasn't human. It was wrong. Twisted. Its eyes were hollow, endless pits of darkness, and its mouth stretched too wide, as though it was smiling in some grotesque way. The face pressed against the glass, its gaze locking with mine. And then, I heard it clearly, the voice whispering from the other side. "You're mine now." I gasped, heart racing as the shadows seemed to reach toward me, pulling at the edges of my vision, dragging me deeper into the darkness. But there was nowhere to run. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The face on the other side of the broken window stared at me, its eyes, those hollow, endless pits of darkness, locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the air around me felt thick, almost suffocating. It was as if the very walls of the room were closing in on me, pushing me toward the broken window, toward the creature outside. The shadowy figures pressed harder against the glass, their forms stretching and twisting unnaturally, like liquid shadows that didn't belong in this world. The face, still grinning grotesquely, didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. I could feel its gaze crawl over every inch of my skin, like 1,000 tiny needles digging into me. "You're mine now." The voice, a whisper so sharp it felt like it was inside my head, echoed in my mind, growing louder with every passing second. I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the shards of glass that littered the floor. But there was no escape. The door still wouldn't open, and the darkness outside the window was no longer just a shadow. It was alive, moving, surrounding me. I could hear the sound of it, a soft, unsettling hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I was trapped. "You cannot leave." The voice came again, louder this time, like it was coming from all directions. I wanted to shut my eyes, to block it out, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the face outside the window, to the thing that was not supposed to be there. The glass around the cracks began to shudder, as if it were struggling to hold itself together. My pulse raced, my mind spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was it? What did it want? The questions raced through my thoughts, but there were no answers, only the suffocating weight of its presence and the gnawing certainty that I was losing my grip on reality. The shadows shifted again, their tendrils creeping along the edges of the broken glass. I could hear the faintest of voices now, soft murmurs that didn't make sense, like fragments of forgotten memories or words spoken in a language I didn't understand. But they were getting closer. Closer. I had to get out. But how? I looked around the room frantically, searching for something, anything, that could help me. The furniture, the walls, even the floor beneath me, felt like they were closing in. I could feel my sanity slipping away, bit by bit, as the whispers and the shadows grew louder, more overwhelming. The window was still there, though. Still broken. And the shadows, they were still pressing against it, as though they were trying to force their way inside. I had to stop it. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I reached for the jagged edges of the broken glass. I didn't know why. Something in me was telling me to do it, to stop the thing outside, to somehow break free from its grip. The glass sliced into my skin as I grabbed hold of it, the sharp edges biting into my palms, but I didn't care. I had to do something, anything, to break the hold it had on me. And then, the world seemed to pause. The shadows froze, the whispers stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was still. The air felt thick with tension, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I looked down at the shards of glass in my hands. There was blood, but it was almost like it wasn't mine. The pain in my palms seemed distant, almost numb, like I was detached from my own body. The shadows outside were still there, but they no longer pressed against the window. They were waiting, watching. The face outside the window, it wasn't grinning anymore. It was smiling. A smile that twisted and stretched impossibly wide, stretching further and further until its mouth split open, revealing nothing but a black void. It seemed to grow in size, consuming the space outside the window, until I could no longer see anything but the face, that horrible, wide smile. I dropped the glass. The whispers resumed, louder now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to scream without sound. The air was suffocating, thick with the weight of something I couldn't understand. The shadows rushed toward me. I backed up, my legs weak, but the room wouldn't let me retreat. The walls were pressing in now, and I could feel the darkness closing around me, pulling me closer to the window, to the face that was now inches from me. "You're mine now." The voice was inside my head again, but this time it was not just a whisper. It was a roar, a deafening scream that tore through my mind like a blade. The darkness enveloped me, and I felt myself falling, tumbling into the void. I never saw the end coming. I never saw the face that would take me. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.